This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good afternoon, everybody, and my name is Bassam Mahfouz. I'm the chair of the Oversight Committee for this year. I'd like to welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public here in the gallery, all watching on the webcast, in fact. So, to the first meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee for this year, 25-26. Today we'll be holding the first part of a three-part investigation on London's place in the government's devolution reforms. Before we begin, I'd like to inform members of the committee and guests that we are participating along with 25 local authorities in a pilot of a new programme called Minute, which is an AI transcription and summary tool developed by government. The recording of this meeting will be automatically transcribed and summarised by the AI tool for comparison with minutes drafted by the clerk in the usual way. Members therefore won't see a difference in the usual minuting service provided, but it will allow us to provide and participate in behind-the-scenes evaluation of the tool. If you would like to understand more about the pilot, please contact the clerk, Paul Goodchild. And if that wasn't exciting enough, I'd also like to remind participants to turn off your phones and put them on silent. And members, if you could please just make sure they're not in front of your microphones. And if you do need to move your microphones, I would just ask you to move them using the base closer to you. So move over to the clerk. Any apologies received for this afternoon's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies this afternoon from Assembly Member Duval, and Assembly Member Desai will be joining us as substitute.
Thank you very much. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if there are any other disclosable pecuniary interest in specific items listed on the agenda? That felt like that was a no, so great. We'll got the membership of the committee. So if we can note the membership and chair arrangements for the committee as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025. In terms of reference and standing delegations, can we note the committee's terms of reference as agreed by the London Assembly and its annual meeting on the 6th of May 2025? The delegations to the chair of the committee and the delegations to chairs of all ordinary committees and subcommittees. And can we note the re-establishment of the working groups by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 6th of May with the terms of reference, seat allocation and memberships? Confirm the minutes of the meeting to be on the 25th of March 2025 to be signed as me as a correct record. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the GLA Oversight Committee? And can we note the response from Mayor of London to the committee's recommendations on the GLA Group Consultations Report? Sorry, guests. Just one more of these. So, in fact, that's it. So, obviously, today's principal business is the question and answer session with invited guests on London's place in the government's devolution reforms. The Assembly and the GLA have been around now for 25 years. So it seems like an apt opportunity to look at what does it look like for the next 25 years. And alongside that, of course, as we know, the government is reviewing devolution reforms across England. And so it seemed like an opportune moment for the committee to consider these questions that we'll be looking at today. I'd like to welcome our first panel of guests who have joined us in the chamber for this discussion. So Professor Patrick Diamond, who is Professor in the Public Policy area at Queen Mary University of London. Dr. Janice Morfitt, who's a visiting professor at Bartlett School of Planning, University and College, London. And Dr. Jack Newman, who is Research Fellow at the University of Bristol. You're all very, very welcome here this morning. So, if you're happy, we'll start with the questions, and the first one is from me. With the government currently considering devolution across England, what do you feel are the key areas of opportunity for London that you feel this bill or future bills should seek to address? We'll start with Janice. Just turn on your mic, please. Thank you.
That one. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me. I think if we look at the devolution white paper, obviously its main aim is not looking particularly at London, but clearly London wants to make sure it's not going to miss out on any potential benefits. And I think perhaps if we look at the objectives of the white paper, which are twofold. First is around completing the devolution settlement for England, for the UK, for England, and obviously that's going back to 1998, and that's of course where you started. So to some extent, you're already provided for in that settlement. The second element is looking at the issue of growth and productivity across England at subnational level, and this of course does include London. And the particular issue which the government has raised and hopes to resolve through the devolution white paper and the bill is the fact that productivity in England is much lower than many other places in the world, and particularly in the OECD countries, which includes the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, as well as European states. So what the government is, and that's shown because out of the G7 countries, the UK is 7th out of those 7 countries in terms of growth and productivity at those levels, and it's 30th out of 37 OECD countries. So clearly there is quite a problem for the UK and England particularly about subnational growth and the way that can contribute to the Prime Minister's growth agenda generally. So part of the white paper which may be, I think, of more particular relevance is to consider what measures the government's proposing on growth, and it's drawing there very heavily on the research of the OECD, which has looked at local economic development and growth in a quite a detailed way since 2000. It had many research projects and programmes. And so what they've been trying to do is to find out what are the preconditions to support more growth at a subnational level. And that when they say growth, it's not just the jobs, but it's also about health and housing and so on. It's a more welfareist approach, if you like, to economic growth. And what the OECD has found, and what's referred to in the white paper, is that places do better in their economies if they're less fragmented institutionally. That is to say, if they have fewer local authorities, or there's the idea of different public bodies operating separately and not together. And I think part of the white paper is designed to try to deal with that. But the other element is that when we look at the application in the white paper of the research from the OECD to see how far it's actually fulfilling the requirements of the OECD's advice, if you like, for the conditions for greater growth, which is what we're all interested in. What we can see is that the OECD have produced a decentralisation handbook, which sounds a bit nerdy, but in fact it's a very useful book because it really talks about the pros and cons, how things that have worked in other countries and how they're structured, what governance methods are used and so on, for 10 principles of growth. And with John Denham, who's a former Labour cabinet minister, I've been examining how far the white paper goes in fulfilling those objectives in the decentralisation handbook, the 10 principles. And I think what we can see is only about half of those are being fulfilled in the white paper. So it's a long answer, long way of coming round to your answer. What could you gain from it? I think, in a way, by investigating further those elements that the government says it wishes to progress in terms of promoting growth, but which are not particularly present in the white in the white paper, but which you in London may be willing to, if you like, move forward. And so these are things around fiscal federalism, having a very clear understanding from government about the extent of powers to be devolved, having a proper devolution framework so that every time a new piece of legislation or new policy is proposed, it's clear which level of government it's actually going to be using it and going to be responsible for it, and also that the funding should follow the powers. So I think those are the things that are particularly important for London in the white paper. I think a lot of the other things about fragmentation, for example, are really addressed to the rest of England, and I'm not sure in a way you can benefit from focusing on those. I think focusing on those elements which are absent, but the government seems to intend to be included, might be more productive for you in the longer term.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Janice. And move over to Jack.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I want to frame what I'm going to say in terms of a dilemma that faces London in response to the English devolution white paper, and that's whether to see itself as an exceptional case in England or to see itself as one of the strategic authorities among many. So historically, London's exceptionalism has benefited it. So in the early 1960s, obviously the London Government Act gave London powers before the rest of the country. The rest of the country then went on a decade-long kind of process of trying to establish a new model of local government. And then obviously in the late 90s and the establishment of the GLA, and then the rest of the country took a lot longer to go through RDAs, LEPs, and eventually combined authorities. So this exceptionalism of London, its kind of unique positioning within England's devolution landscape has often been a benefit. And maybe we can link this to its size as a city that is much bigger than any other in the country, or its political, economic and cultural uniqueness in the country. However, I think there is a concern that this exceptionalism could be a weakness in the emerging devolution landscape. So the devolution model that is emerging now is one that's very dynamic. It's a ladder which different places are climbing. You have Greater Manchester and the West Midlands towards the top of the ladder, who are seen as to be trailblazers by Whitehall, and then others further down and others just starting to climb. And there is a concern that if London's model remains static, that other places may, in the medium to longer term, overtake it in certain powers. And in certain functions. I don't think there's any immediate chance of this happening. I know Janice disagrees with me on this. There's no immediate chance of this happening in the sense that London is a long way ahead in a lot of what it does, even in comparison to Greater Manchester, which is held out to be the most advanced combined authority elsewhere in England. But so in terms of going back to this dilemma, one option for London is to look globally, look to global cities as collaborators, as comparators, look outwards and basically see what's going on in England as other places may be catching up and not a great deal of concern. However, I think there's a lot to be said for London being part of that emerging debate nationally about what other places should look like in England, what other places can learn from London. And I just want to conclude by giving two examples. Both are in terms of the governance arrangement specifically. Happy to talk about funding and powers later, but just thinking about the governance arrangements. So firstly, you have the question about the relationship between the mayor and the constituent local authorities, which in London is quite unique. The local authorities obviously have relatively little say. The Manchester model is all built on local authorities working together, collaborating, and they are seen to kind of be the core of the institution. I think although there are concerns about fragmentation, I think there is a lot to be said for giving local authorities a greater say in what happens at the strategic level, not least to bring them together in terms of the various functions and powers that they do have to work more collaboratively and think about how collaboration between the two tiers can work. But broadly, I think the answer for England is not just all to follow the Manchester model, but to think about what different models work in different places, to reflect different political setups, different historical trajectories. I think London should be part of that debate in saying that this shouldn't just be about everywhere following Greater Manchester. London has a lot to offer, and it's maybe a menu of options needs to be offered. And the very final thing I'll say is about something London has that the rest of the country doesn't have, and which I think is a key part of London's contribution to the emerging devolution debate, and that's the Assembly. I strongly believe that the Assembly model should be rolled out, maybe over a longer period of time, elsewhere in the country. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but I think it's important because you have scrutiny committees in combined authorities that are basically not functioning. The meetings aren't happening. If they are happening, they don't have the powers, they don't have the resources, not the incentives for councillors to do it, etc., etc., etc. And there's been some attempt to beef up that scrutiny model, but I don't think it's ultimately going to work. And probably what will happen in years to come is there will be scandals and people will look, or there'll be failings at least, and people will look and say, why wasn't this scrutinised effectively? And the weakness of the combined authority scrutiny model will come to the fore. So this isn't necessarily something that London needs to do, but it's an important opportunity for London to sell the Assembly model and think about what other broader functions it could have, particularly in terms of rebuilding democracy and democratic engagement. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jack, and certainly going to come back to a number of those points throughout the investigation. Patrick, over to yourself.
Well, I've just got a couple of points to add. I should say, though, Chair, just at the beginning, I want to declare two very brief interests, which is that I was a special advisor in the Blair and Brown governments between 2000 and 2010, and I was also a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark between 2010 and 2014. So I suppose ancient history in one sense, but I did want to make committee members aware of that background in terms of what I'm going to say this afternoon. I just want to add really to what Janice and Jack have been saying by, I think, building on your opening remark, Chair, which is that I think in many ways the London devolution government settlement is an extraordinary success if you look at the history of changes to the machinery of government in the UK over the last century. I mean, as I think the previous speakers have also emphasised, we live in a country where governance has been approached through a lot of churn and instability. There's been a lot of changes in institutions. If you look elsewhere in England, we've gone from having regional development agencies to having LEPs, to having new investment zones and combined authorities in the space of about 15 years. So we've had this extraordinary pattern of change. And I think what in some ways distinguishes the London devolution settlement is its continuity. So congratulations on making it through 25 years. But the reason why I think that's relevant is that it raises the question of if it isn't broke, don't fix it. In the sense that I think there's a strong argument to be said that the London devolution structures work quite well. As Jack was saying, I think the combination of the Mayor and the Assembly in terms of the sharing of the executive and policy function has been really quite successful, at least by the standards of other governance institutions across England and the UK. And so I think there is a compelling argument to say if we're going to change this devolution structure further, we should be very careful about those changes given the relative success of London's governance settlement. But I think there are sort of three areas that I would just highlight in terms of your specific question on the white paper. I mean, I think the first is clearly the opportunity to, with government, negotiate an integrated funding settlement in 26-27, which would afford, I think, significant opportunities for London to think about how it can strategically use public money and resources to more effectively achieve the policy outcomes that are important to the London elected members. I think the second element which Janice touched on is the question of how does London compare with other global cities? And I think here there is a sense that in order for London to meet the challenge in the next 20 years of growth and productivity, we have to give London more opportunity to shape policies that are in its own interests, direct investment, generate more economic growth. And so I think that the reference in the white paper to looking at the examples of other cities and working through how we can apply that to London is extremely important. And then the third area, which perhaps we can come back to in our discussion, is about how we incorporate the boroughs within the structure of shared decision-making. As I say, I'm very strongly of the view that the current settlement is working well, but I think we should also consider the question of how do we give local authorities in London perhaps more of a stake and a say in the decision-making structures in terms of how London achieves the important goals in the future around growth and productivity in public services. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move over to Alex Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Well, good afternoon, all. So, if you could all, three of you or whoever wants to answer, briefly talk about how effectively we'd measure the success of the English devolution bill reforms if they were to go ahead in their current guise or as we go along. How would you measure? I know Janice, you've spoken about growth and productivity in quite a lot of depth, but obviously that's the basis of that is probably around more fiscal devolution, which we'll come on to later, and competition between combined and local authorities. So, yeah, how would you judge success on those lines?
Happy to... Or did you want to... No, go for it. I mean, just to jump in very quickly with one comment in response to your question, I think that there are ways in which you can measure success around economic and fiscal criteria, which are obviously important. But I think this alludes to a broader question about the whole devolution process, which is the exclusive focus on economic growth correct? And I would just give two other areas where I think it's important to measure the impact that devolution is having. One is democratic participation. So is devolution leading, for example, to a more engaged electorate? And is it engaging citizens more successfully in the process of government? How we measure that obviously varies, but we can do that through things like electoral turnout, participation in policy-making processes and so on. So I think that's important. I think also we should be looking at success not just through growth, not just through democratic participation, but also through the impact that we have on the quality of place. And that means measurements using, for example, social cohesion indicators. To what extent do people feel part of the communities that they live in? So a broader notion of place. And I think, where successive governments have got to is a quite understandable focus on the importance of growth. But I think we run the risk of overestimating the importance of economic growth when other things are also important: democratic participation, the environment, the places where people live, people's ability to participate in politics. So I think we need to measure those things as well, would be my brief response to your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I would very much echo the concern about measuring the success of devolution purely on a growth metric, because growth is impacted by all sorts of different factors, and it's very difficult. People try in the literature, but it's very difficult to link the growth to the actual devolution to evidence that. And I think there's a broader concern that if we just pin it all on growth, and there isn't growth for whatever international or national reasons, that we'll see devolution as a failure, whereas it actually might have been a success. So I completely agree with that. The other area where I think measuring success, there's a great deal of potential, is in public health. And I suppose well-being more broadly, although that's much more difficult to measure, but improving public health outcomes as being a kind of key metric that a devolution model has worked. And I don't just mean around whether the local NHS has worked, which I know is obviously not within the remit of a lot of combined authorities, but how have they used transport and housing and skills and many of their other powers to actually make people healthier and improve the health of the region, which I think is a good proxy indicator of kind of public well-being. Yeah, thank you.
I think the measure of success, perhaps if I can just look outside London for a minute. I mean, the UK is the most centralised country, again, in the OECD. So we have so many decisions are taken centrally by the Treasury and so on, and that has actually increased since Brexit for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have become more centralised. So success for me would actually be more decentralised decision-making and in a way for the GLA to be a model for all the other subnational units of government. We talked a bit about Greater Manchester, and this is where Jack and I disagree, that Greater Manchester, the mayor only has competencies, he has no powers, and actually is reliant on the powers of the constituent authorities. Whereas, as far as I'm aware, you have all the powers of local government, which is about 1,900 powers, which your boroughs have as well. So I think the strength of the country in terms of thinking about its democratic basis, inclusion, thinking about those who feel that we are not really engaging our citizens. I think we need to see a more decentralised approach and far fewer decisions taken at the centre, when you as local politicians have a much better idea about what will work and what flies locally and where the priorities should be. There's another element on redistribution which I think is very central, and that's very central in the OECD stuff, but is not really very apparent in the English devolution white paper. So those are the sorts of areas of success I think that would be good to see, that we were just a less centralised country.
Thank you, Pat. All fantastic assessments, by the way. I don't think I disagreed with much of any of it. But Patrick, one you mentioned the democratic deficit, and probably given your previous career in and around Number 10, the main consternation where democracy probably did work was the election of Ken Livingstone as an independent. And I guess my question to you would, one way of seeing success of greater devolution and power to local authorities where people have doesn't have to be a mayor, it could be a unitary council, where people know how to blame on particular metrics, would actually, the more election, although I would disagree with it, of independent candidates, because people can monitor, well, the last one was X party, I didn't like what they said, I'm paying attention now because this individual council has so much power. Do you think that could be one of the repercussions of greater devolution? And would that be a good thing? I mean, you know.
I do think it's a repercussion, and I think to build on your question, I think one of the successes of devolution is that it has to some extent put pressure on the current party system. Now, of course, those who are already part of that established structure don't like it. And as you pointed out in the example of Ken Livingstone, people within the Labour Party at the time were obviously deeply uncomfortable with how that process played out. But you know, it did inject, I think, a degree of kind of challenge and innovation into the system, which is important. I think we're at very early days in learning to what extent devolution across England is going to have a fundamental impact on some of those democratic deficit questions like turnout. The indications so far suggest that turnout hasn't been dramatically impacted by directly elected mayors. But obviously we can see how that will play out in the future. And whether having candidates who are less attached to traditional party structures and more about local identity in place can do something to improve the deficit and the turnout level is, I think, certainly something that I'll be looking at in terms of how this evolves in the next few years.
Thank you. Move on to Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. I couldn't help but pick up on one of the big definitions there, as Assemblymember Georgie was saying, being on this democratic engagement. And I couldn't help but reflecting on the location now of City Hall and actually where your devolved power sits. And that, I think, it probably is perhaps something that we have to look at in devolution, is where do the decisions happen? If you are devolving powers. Obviously, we've seen a central location move out east and a massive drop in public participation as a reflection of that. But I don't know, perhaps there's not much really to add, but I suppose because we've already done it here in London, but I suppose perhaps looking at where the devolved power actually sits is something that across the country they might want to consider. I just wanted to move on more to what this means for London. And whether any of you had any opinions on whether London should be treated differently to the rest of England in the design.
Yeah, could I pick up on that very briefly? In that, I think it should be treated differently, but only to the extent that there needs to be more differentiation across England in the design of governance arrangements. I think there's been too much focus on trying to make one model fit for every place, and that has caused unexpected problems when it clashes up against, I don't know, the number of constituent authorities, which in London is a big issue, or the political makeup of those constituent authorities, which is an issue in certain parts of the country, west of England, Cambridge and Peterborough. So I think there needs to be more awareness that different parts of the country potentially need different governance arrangements. Although there is the flip side of that is that you create a lot of complexity in the system and it becomes unwieldy, and it's very difficult for people to understand what's happening and for Whitehall to make policy. So I think a menu of options for places is probably the best way to go.
I just think one particular specific way, and it's just really, again, partly disagreeing, I think, with Patrick. I think an integrated settlement in the current format would be a retrograde step for London. And the reason for that is when you look deep down into the published documents from the Treasury and MHCLG, what you find is the integrated settlements, those budgets, are going to be run by programme boards. And the programme boards are going to be chaired by senior civil servants, which is a requirement of the Treasury because of the accounting officer principle. And so the contributing departments into those integrated budgets, of which there are 90 sources of money in 5 channels, if you like, five silos, they all have a role in accountability back to to Parliament for that expenditure, and therefore the Treasury requires them to control that expenditure. Now, I think until the integrated settlement is reformed and accounting officers are reformed, I think that would be very specifically a retrograde step for you to consider at the minute, and your freedoms over your budgets are far greater than anyone else in England has, and are much more akin to First Ministers. So I do think that one should think very, very carefully about going down that line, because that seems like a very controlling route which would diminish your powers.
Makes sense. I think that just if I could follow up on your point, and you mentioned obviously the powers being more akin to the First Minister, and I think this is probably a good point to say that's where we see ourselves as an assembly, is that when we're comparing, we would see ourselves more in comparison with the Scottish Parliament than, say, in combined authorities like the Manchester Mayor. So it's an important point, I think, are trying to highlight here.
Yeah, I think, can I just say, I've been in Scotland the last 2 days at an event where people like John Curtis have been participating, and certainly London wasn't primarily on the agenda, of course, but nevertheless in the conversation over 2 days, London was very much, the GLA is very much seen as part of a similar organisation as an institution as the Scottish Parliament. So they also see it in the same way as you do, which I think is quite encouraging.
Massively, thanks, Jen. Yeah.
So I just wanted to build on your point there. I think it just emphasises the importance of understanding that these are two, in some ways, quite separate historical processes, because the London Assembly and the structure of governance in London was part of the devolution process initiated by the governments in the late 1990s, which, as you rightly say, was also connected to devolution to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So that was it was a particular model of devolution, which had a particular understanding of decentralisation, delegation and devolution. But it's quite different to the combined authority model, which has organically emerged since the late 2000s, and is in some ways actually, I think, ultimately was a response to the failure of the North East Regional Assembly referendum in 2004, and then from there on in an attempt to try and initiate a structure for sub-regional governance in England, which, as I say, has different origins, a different motivation and a different logic to what we've seen with the devolution to Scotland, Wales and London, Northern Ireland and so on. So I think that's why we see these quite significant difference of emphases in structure and institutions. I disagree, of course, about the integrated settlement point. I can see why Janice has been sat in the middle here to try and generate some conflict in this discussion. Maybe we can come back to that specifically. The other thing I wanted to say just quickly in response to your question was also about asymmetry, because I think one of the issues that we get concerned about in English governance is has asymmetry gone too far? Do we have too many conflicting structures? Is it too messy? And to some degree, the devolution white paper is an attempt to address that. But I do want to just say, on the point of international comparisons, it's very striking that when you look at other liberal democracies of an equivalent size to the UK, the governance structures also tend to be very asymmetric. There's a lot of mess. And so I think we have to be in some ways a bit more comfortable with recognising, as Jack said, that we should be wary of imposing uniformity. We need different governance structures for different parts of England, and I think, as we've been saying in this discussion, London needs a distinctive devolution settlement, which should not be sort of falsely made part of the wider English devolution settlement. I think it's really important to respect the differences and the distinctiveness of London as a place, which needs its own governance arrangements that shouldn't be, as I say, made to replicate what we see in the other combined authorities across England.
Thank you very much. Going to move on over to Assembly Member Hina Bukhari.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say how much I'm enjoying this. I love listening to experts because it helps, and also we're all a bit geeky here as well. So we are very pleased that you're here. My questions are about treating London differently to the rest of England. I think you've already been touching on that. Now, Jack, you probably well aware of the London Council's position, and I would like to know very clearly from you, what are the risks and benefits of having 32 London boroughs being consulted? I mean, does that mean that there will be a slowing down of decision-making, a less robust scrutiny? Because that's pretty much the impression I'm going to be putting across. But I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. There are trade-offs in either approach. Janice raised the point of fragmentation, and there is evidence that the fragmentation of decision-making causes certain problems in terms of being able to have a strategy that joins at various policy areas and is able to be long-term and isn't at risk of being destabilised by political disagreements. And I think that is evidence in some part of the country where combined authorities being based on agreement between local authorities have basically become derailed by disagreements within the between places and between parties, and the way that those two things intersect, which I'm sure is also a dynamic that would to some extent play out in London. So there are risks. I think the benefits of bringing in constituent authorities to be part of the decision making. It doesn't necessarily have to mean London becomes a Manchester model, where previously you needed complete agreement between all the authorities to get anything done, or now means you need a majority. It doesn't necessarily need to be that model to give local authorities more of a say. But the benefits do include the fact that you can draw on a much wider range of resources and capacity in the system by getting people aligned behind a strategy. And I think this is where the Greater Manchester model is successful, although it's not necessarily something that we should think is London's future. But it's the fact that so many different public agencies in Greater Manchester are able to work together and align behind the same strategy without there necessarily being kind of formal constraints that make them do so. A lot of it's based on the convening arrangements and agreement about what the priorities are for the region in the future. And I do think there's a lot of value in that. So I know that's a bit of a fence-sitting argument, but those are some of the kind of risks and benefits of the two approaches, I think. Yeah.
May I just add that I grew up in London. I'm a creature. My education was I have had London County Council on my exercise books when I started, so I'm that old. So I'm used to strong government in London, and that's the system I'm kind of most familiar with. And I suppose what I'm doing now is thinking about that period between the end of the GLC and the beginning of the GLA. And I think if you want to see what's going to happen, if you want a more fragmented and diversified decision-making period, see, well, what happened to London in that period? And the answer is not much. And I know there was the Government Office for London for part of that period from 92 onwards. But again, and some pan-London bodies for planning and so on. But I do think that the kind of propulsion forward of London in its many diverse aspects in terms of policy, progress, economy, presence on the national and international stage really became associated with the creation of this body. And yet, if I think back to the GLC, there was some of that was there with the GLC being a leader, again, internationally at that time. And so without that and dissipating that control or that leadership, perhaps I should say, then I think there are I can see the disbenefits having lived through both systems for many years.
Could I just quick...
Oh, yeah, of course.
Sorry, just to make a quick point, which is I think there's one concern about the emerging English devolution agenda that focuses on mayoral areas, and I think this applies to London as well, is that although power is being decentralised, it's only being decentralised so far. And this country has a missing tier of neighbourhood government that some parish councils and town councils fulfil, some don't, some areas don't have them. And I think there is a danger that decentralisation just means national to regional, rather than national to regional to local to neighbourhood to people, which is the join-up that will ultimately maybe start to move some of those numbers around turnout and democratic engagement that I think will be is already a consistent theme of this conversation. Yeah.
I mean, Patrick, you were saying earlier, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I'd like to know a little bit more about that position that you have, because cannot this institution be improved? Maybe there's more that we can do. If the proposal of the mayor getting more powers, does that not mean that the London Assembly should as well?
Totally agree, and I think my point about don't tinker for the sake of it is more about recognising that that's something we've persistently done in the governance of the UK and England, and not always very successfully. So my argument is absolutely not against any form of change, but is more we should always be careful and consider and reflect carefully on where proposals for change are made. Are they going to make things better? I think the general direction of travel, as Janice indicated, is that London has been a successful city in the last 25 years. I don't think you can attribute all of those successes to the governance structure or to the members of the London Assembly, although, of course, you've had a critical role in that success, no doubt. But exactly. But it's obviously it's a wider process. But I want to make just two comments on the issue of the distinctiveness of London and whether the boroughs should have more of a stake in decision-making, which is to say, again, on origins, I think it's important to, of course, always remember that in the combined authorities like Greater Manchester, which is the example most often cited, the governance of Greater Manchester comes from a very specific place, which is the collaboration between local authorities from the late 1980s, really, around projects of regeneration, housing, spatial planning and so on, which over time came together into the eventual formation of the combined authority. I don't need to tell you that the position in London is really quite different to that. We don't have that history, we don't have that heritage, we don't have that tradition. So it's, I think, a very different case. I would, though, say, secondly, that and this is a terrible academic concept, but in the academic debate we talk about the idea of multi-level governance. So the idea that good public policy often arises from different tiers of government working together. I think the problem we have in our debate in the UK and England sometimes is that we think about the national, regional and local as working in opposition to each other, whereas actually we have to get them working together. Many of these devolved authorities don't have much capacity. They need central government to work with them on big infrastructure projects, on modernising transportation, on building more houses. And so, as I say, I think the mentality has to be, how do we work together with central government? But also, drawing on what Jack was saying, there will be elements of policy in London which may be better delivered at the level below the London government tier. Neighbourhoods need that sensitivity of decision-making. They need to be able to do things that individual places need. I'm very conscious that the labour market, the employment system is very different in different parts of London. And we need a structure of decision-making and delivery that reflects that. So, as I say, terrible concept, but I think multi-level governance is a way of thinking about the kind of framework we need, which is going to get things done for the citizens of London, as well as obviously being financially efficient and making sure we deliver good use of public money.
Thank you. Assembly Member Georgiou with a very quick follow-up.
I don't know about very quick. I was just going to say, I think, I'm someone that generally doesn't like to mince my words, and where a lot of, I think, our questioning comes from, I'm coming off the back of Assembly Member Bakari, is essentially London councils is an organisation which I have zero time for, is pushing this fragmentation agenda. They're asking effectively for 32 people to get into a room, challenge the mayor and then come out with a conclusion, which is never going to happen. It's never worked in history. But it leads me on to my next point, which is on the point, one of the things, my concerns with the English devolution bill, and I think the previous government suffered from this same problem and mistake, is that they've allowed celebrity mayors, so Andy Burnham, a wildly popular figure in Greater Manchester, Ben Houchen in Tees Valley, and even Andy Street, I think because of the way they appeared to be getting things done, hid a fact, Janice, which you've, I think, alighted on, is the fact they had next to no power. They were extremely good at asking for money and making it appear as if central... do you see what I mean? They have convening power. Yes, they've managed to attract investment, but not in the same way that a mayor of London could, who has much more power, as you've mentioned. So do you think policymakers truly understand the powers that are there and aren't there? Because I think they don't.
I think they don't. This is, again, something that I know John Denham isn't here today, but having been in that position, we've talked about, and his view is that basically local politicians in combined authorities and the mayors don't want to discuss this because, firstly, they don't want to say they don't have any power. I mean, what politician wants to say that? But secondly, because we've been through such a period from 2010 in terms of austerity and having things stripped out, that certainly there's a sense that people wanting to just hang on to what they've got, and therefore there isn't any honesty in the debate. And I think, personally, the elephant in the room in the whole of this devolution white paper is why aren't these other, why don't we have a class of government, a subnational government at strategic level, like a local authority, have a strategic authority and a local authority, but as part of the same kind of family of governance. And why aren't these other authorities being created like you? And I think that isn't being discussed at all. And actually, I was really quite shocked and surprised to see in the white paper that you were described as a bespoke organisation, whereas, as Patrick said, you know, going back to the instigation of this institutional model, we were talking about this being the model for everywhere in England. And I think that's a debate that's not being had. And I think you're right. I think the politicians involved in this are frightened to raise it because of the spectre of the Treasury, you know, as we know, always very keen to maintain that power. So they're frightened of losing what little powers they're being given.
I've got Assembly Member Prince who'd like to do a very quick follow-up. Thanks.
Janet, maybe Patrick as well. Building on Assemblymember Giorgio's point about London councils, my experience of them was that there's a lot of myopia there. If you have to make a strategic decision, often the leader of the council would say, yeah, but that doesn't benefit my council. And so my question to you is, how do you overcome that, I'm calling it myopia, without having a strategic body to make a decision that benefits all, rather than each council looking at its own cost of benefits or disbenefits on any given issue?
I think there are a couple of ways. I mean, one, if we go back to the history of Greater Manchester, for example, they have an organisation called AGMA, the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities, which was created after Metropolitan County was abolished at the same time as the GLC. And they appreciated that unless they appeared to work together externally, you know, they really understood the one voice to government kind of political approach, even though there were different parties. I mean, I know behind the scenes they disagree violently and vehemently and still do, but nevertheless, externally, you couldn't put a cigarette paper between them, and that's a political strategy which they've adopted, and which has been reinforced through its own success, you might say. So I think the way they have managed to, if you like, coalesce around projects or around an agenda, shall we say, has been really through looking at the distribution of major investment projects, and that's their mechanism. So they have 3 major investment projects for the whole of Greater Manchester, and then they have another 10. There are 10 authorities, so there's one in each of the authorities, but these 3 bigger ones overall. And I think it's an understanding that they won't each get their individual projects unless they hang together. So I do think that they've understand the realpolitik of it. Whether you could do that for 32 boroughs, I think, is another matter. And I think we have to remember that London boroughs haven't been in any way changed, have they, since 1965? And it's the most long-serving form of subnational government in the country. So any reconstruction of London boroughs in itself, and that's also quite a major change to think about how you might do that, because you might want to do that change in conjunction with if you wanted to redistribute the powers within London to give them more of a say. And that also seems quite a disruptive route to go on.
Although, of course, it's happening outside of London on our doorstep at the moment. So, yeah. Patrick.
I don't have anything significant to add to what Janice has already said. I mean, the theme of my comments so far today has been things are working relatively well, so be very careful what you start meddling with. And I think in terms of the structure of the boroughs, I would make the same point, which is that London boroughs have been in place since 1965. Again, an extraordinary piece of institutional continuity by UK standards. I'd be very cautious about ripping everything up at this point, when I think there's a basis for a devolved settlement that can work. And rather than thinking about you know, a 32-member veto body that can try and control what the mayor is doing. I'm sure there are ways in which opportunities for alliances and collaboration across London boroughs can be strengthened, but a model of incorporating that within a formal structure, for all the reasons Janice says, I think could be very problematic.
Okay, thank you very much. You've got Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. Sorry, just move this a bit closer. Yes, so my question to Janice to start with is about the integrated settlement for London, and the Mayor has described some of the onerous rules that are attached to the multiple small pots of government funding, and he said it's a reform that he's wanted to put in place for some time to let London set its priorities and give us the flexibility to let us use sort of our knowledge about our situation here in London to make our money go as far as possible, paraphrasing. Yes, sort of what do you think are the main opportunities and risks arising from the proposed integrated settlement for London?
I think if you think about those 90 funding streams, funding sources that are in the integrated settlement in their 5 silos, I think if you were able to bring those together, or maybe a different subset, but you know, if you were able to follow that point that you're making about those small pots and bringing them together, and they were under the Mayor's control, then I think that might prove beneficial, and it's another way of dealing with fragmentation, isn't it, in some particular policy and delivery areas. So that would be a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm not opposed to having integrated settlement as a principle. I think what I'm very cautious about is this current version of it. And that's really what I was trying to say. When we look at the Memorandum of Understanding Annex, May 2024, what we see is the mechanism for the way it's being rolled out. So, as I say, there'll be a programme board which will be chaired by a senior civil servant, which will comprise primarily senior civil servants from different government departments, and maybe only 1 or 2 people from the Mayor and you know, the Mayor's side, if you like. And they will set the programme for delivery of that funding. They will set the objectives. They also set the performance framework against which the Mayor will be judged for the delivery of a programme that they haven't set. I'm paraphrasing, but this is what it says. So do you really want this system in this format? So this is the question I'm asking. So I think an integrated settlements have great benefits. Mm-hmm. It's just that this current version seems to me to be not offering anything to you, where you've already got far greater powers, more generally. So
I mean, I get the impression that the Mayor is asking for maybe for a London-specific integrated settlement, because you know what we've seen over the last few years, for instance with Transport for London budgets, where they've been going hand to mouth, month to month, then year to year, but no opportunity for doing that long-term strategic planning that they could be doing. And I think, you know, sort of having, so I get the impression that what the Mayor is keen on, and actually what I think potentially could be really helpful to London, is to have more long-term settled funding streams that can be planned and used more strategically.
I mean, if you look at the rhetoric around integrated settlements, that is exactly what it says. And it says, you know, the mayors will have the opportunity to vie between budgets and so on. But the difficulty is that when we look at the practical arrangements as are currently set out by the last and the current government, which they're continuing the same arrangements, then they aren't that. They are a more controlling, centralised version. So we're talking, the same term is being used to describe 2 different things. As far as I can see. So I think, you know, what you're describing is exactly what is in this OECD model of decentralisation, and that you do have that control. And that's, in fact, one of the 10 guidelines featured there. So that's an absolutely positive thing. But I think what I'd be very cautious about is, as there's a muddling of these terms in terms of the kind of high level and the practical approaches that are being delivered. If you look at the single outcomes framework document for Greater Manchester or the one for the West Midlands, they are being monitored on a minute percentage of increased bus usage per year. Mm-hmm. This is the level of detail that is incorporated in some... when you think of the size of your budget and activity in TfL, and you look at what's included in these outcome frameworks, I think you will see this disparity which I'm referring to.
And do you... I was under the impression that London was sitting aside from the sort of Greater Manchester model.
It may be.
But we need to push for that.
I would say that as the terms are being used interchangeably, as a former local government officer, a chief executive and a former senior civil servant, I would just say I'd be careful about the use of those terms.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Patrick, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think the fact that Janice has been a senior civil servant means that obviously she has a unique perspective in terms of how civil servants think. Look, all I would add is that, but that's relevant to what I want to say, which is simply to say that I think with integrated settlements we can think about them in terms of the formal structure of how they're designed, but there's also the question of the culture within which Whitehall negotiates them. And I don't think that's the done deal in the way that Janice implies. I think there is an opportunity for London decision makers to work with central government to get the kind of appropriate framework that a place like London needs. I mean, it would clearly be ludicrous to tie a London funding settlement to the monitoring of minutiae targets and outcome frameworks. And that's not the way that devolution should proceed. And it's not been, I think, so far, at least, the rhetoric, at least of some government ministers. And I think government ministers have to be, as it were, pressured or persuaded that if they're serious about devolution, then that's got to mean the kind of approach to integrated funding settlements which does allow scope for local discretion, flexibility and so on. So I think Janice's pessimism is legitimate, but I think perhaps too pessimistic.
Can I just say that post-Brexit, sorry, excuse us, before Brexit, then some government departments actually had quite a lot of funding and policy pass-through from the EU, and that would be transport, it would be DWP, it would be energy, for example. And post-Brexit, that freedom and that kind of agenda airspace and priority, which would be created by decisions made jointly between the European members, has been lost. And all the initiative has gone back to the Treasury. And one interpretation of what's going on in terms of the activity levels of certain departments in the English Devolution White Paper, which I've analysed and I think I've provided for you a summary and a briefing note, is that it allows them to get back a bit of airtime, political airtime and funding control, which they've lost post-2016. So in a way, it's the Devolution White Paper becomes a vehicle for them to re-establish a bit of control over their budgets and a bit more political space in government. And in a way that the single outcome framework, which we've seen, was very detailed, in a way just reinforces that view, I think, about there are other agendas going on here apart from devolution per se.
Yeah, sorry, can I just add one very quick point, which is that I'm not responding. This is not an argument.
I'll bring you in, Jack, after.
No, exactly. But sorry, Jack, we should come to Jack. But the only point I wanted to add, which in a sense I think is more in agreement with what Janice is saying, is that we should never forget, the mentality of a lot of Whitehall civil servants remains very centralising. So that there is a great deal of caution about devolution in general, and I think we haven't perhaps done enough to break through that. I think also the point that in many departments the devolution settlement across the UK and England in particular is just not very well understood. Now, maybe that's a reflection of the fact that there's been a relatively large degree of change in a short period of time, but surely one of the big priorities for Whitehall colleagues is to make sure that they have a clearer grip on the distribution of policy responsibilities that arises from the new devolution settlement which is being created. And I think in many departments that just doesn't exist at the moment.
I agree. Yeah.
Do you think it's also a problem that there isn't a good, strong understanding of how decision-making works in London? Because the mayor, you know, he's got his statutory strategies. We hold him to account for delivery against those statutory strategies, which is a, you know, decent amount of control. And the mayor is delivering, you know, his £22 billion budget, and we scrutinise that. But that is a level of scrutiny that just doesn't exist anywhere else across England.
Yeah, could I come in?
Yeah.
'Cause I think, firstly, just to respond to that point, I completely agree. I think part of the problem here is the way in which accountability functions in the wider system in the UK, which is that it goes up and up and up to the Treasury and notionally to Parliament, whereas actually London has arrangements where accountability can function at the local level through the Assembly, and other areas could learn a lot from this. But there is a broader need to kind of start to think about how accountability functions. There's been talk about local accounts committees previously as ways of addressing this. If you're going to give a flexible funding settlement of a sizable amount to an executive, especially where there is no political or limited political opposition except at election times, you do need accountability, but that accountability doesn't always need to come from the Treasury through the measurement of outcomes. And here's another quick point I wanted to make here, is that one of the problems with the kind of outcomes frameworks that come with the integrated settlements is they're very tightly limited by what they can actually measure. And given the complexity of data existing at different scales, it's sometimes quite difficult to measure certain things. And actually, you might not necessarily be able to measure in a tight way that suits Treasury the kind of things that you actually want to achieve. And finally, just to say, fiscal devolution is a missing part of this conversation that the current government have clearly pushed back against, but is a major part of that.
We're coming to that.
So, and on that point,
I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you so much, and a beautifully transition there. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Obviously, I guess one of both the benefits and risks of the integrated settlement is potentially more freedom and accountability for the mayor. So I kind of want to bring in the GLA 1999 Act, and I think it just got touched upon there, but obviously the existing 7 statutory strategies. With an integrated settlement, perhaps that becomes even more of a safeguard, right? Is that, you know, the mayor's got more freedom, but there's still the 7 statutory strategies to deliver against. Is there anything else that perhaps needs adding, or anything that needs taking away, or any other safeguards for it that would kind of interplay with this through the GLA Act 1999 being revised?
Just to pick up on the point that Jack made, I think there is a provision in the devolution white paper for the, if you like, the localisation of accounting officers and that accounting officer system. Because at the minute, the permanent secretary is responsible for funding and is not accountable to the minister, but to Parliament, strangely. And so that there will be the accounting officer for Department for Transport will be responsible for TfL. You don't have an accounting officer for London. There is an accounting officer in Scotland, one for Wales and one for Northern Ireland. And so whilst you have this, it's very hard to get a kind of integrated approach to delivery if you're constantly having to go back through government departments and then to Parliament. And so I think one thing that you might look for is if you consider that there might be greater integration between your strategies and more horizontal working in order to bring greater benefits rather than the 7 strategy silos. I'm overstating it a bit, but then having your own accounting officer might make a difference, because in Scotland, for example, they've abolished government departmental structures and just have a single executive that works across themes and priorities. But to some extent, you know, you're still being forced back into these lines of accountability, back into Whitehall. So the question that perhaps is for you is, does this inhibit your ability to work in a more integrated way, horizontally and vertically? And would having your own accounting officer as the next step, as they have in, say, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, would that bring benefits to you? And if you had that, would the accounting officer have to report back to Parliament, or would, as proposed in the white paper, you have a local kind of select committee type arrangement? So that is an obvious next organisational step if you think it would bring the opportunity for, if you like, more local accountability, but more integration, because I think that's what's prevented by the current system.
Just to confirm then, if you were answering that question, then the answer would be yes. Yeah. Don't know if Jack or Patrick, do you have anything to add?
I mean, the only thing I was going to just say is that when you interview actors who are working in different parts of the English devolution system, I think one of the most persistent issues that comes across from what they say in terms of making devolution work is siloisation. So having to make devolution work at the local level, but through categories of service delivery and organisation that reflect Whitehall departments. And the real opportunity with devolution, as Jan has said, I think, is to break out of that and think about delivery that is much more integrated and joined up. I think if you look at Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all of those three devolved administrations have in different ways been able to be more effective at joining up service delivery and public policy. And it seems to me that, yeah, it's a good question to think about how might London do that in the context of potentially revisiting the 99 Act.
Only to say that this goes back to the earlier question about how would you measure the success of devolution, and the joining up at the local level is potentially one of the ways in which you do that, because that's potentially one of the big potentials of greater devolution, is that local join up. Yeah.
And I was only come back to the thing with some of the statutory powers, some of the statutory strategies, is that it brings with it some of the very few teeth the Assembly has around veto powers. So if there was more integration, how would that look? And is it important to still have those veto powers, I suppose, on the 2/3?
I suspect, obviously, the Assembly's got to have the power to hold to account, and if that's another interpretation of veto powers, if you like. But then what you might be wanting to think about is different dimensions of holding to account, and thinking, you know, I've criticised the single outcomes framework which the government has got for Greater Manchester and the West Mids. But in terms of an outcomes framework, you could have a more integrated outcomes, set of outcomes for yourself across the strategies, which would then possibly lead to thinking about bringing funding together in different ways to achieve more benefits, and whether that's around health and transport, or whether it's about, you know, mental health and work, or whatever, you know, is important in which part of London or which part of a strategy. But it just at the minute, you know, TfL just has to report back to the Department for Transport, and to some extent you will always be bounded by the conceptualisation of transport in that department, in terms of the how far you can go to really stretch out, say, to mental health or other public health issues. That's probably not a very good example, but hopefully you get the point I'm making, that there are those boundaries, which Patrick said, which we'll always hit against, and that may be preventing the best outcomes for London.
Can I just add a very short... Oh, sorry, Chair.
Sorry, just I'm sure you'll be able to bring anything back in, but just very conscious that we've got some big questions that we still want to make sure that we ask you. So we're going to bring in one of our big hitters for this one.
Thank you. I would just make the point that the Transport for London does have its own board that it is accountable to, and of course we have a committee system as well here. But I just want to really go back and just look at perhaps in the future what types of powers and functions the Mayor should have in any new devolution settlement for London. And the Mayor was asked recently about who we should compare ourselves to, and just he says, you know, that we are a devolved administration like Scotland and Wales. Our comparators, I say in a respectful way, are not Greater Manchester, Liverpool and so forth. They are New York City, Singapore and those cities, because businesses that leave London are not going to go to other parts of the country, they're going to go to other parts of the world. And so I'm just looking at the future. What comparable international cities should we be looking towards, and what powers do you think the Mayor and the Assembly should be asking for? Yeah, Jack.
Thank you. So I think broadly a set of powers that the Mayor should be asking for are around social policy. I think there's been too much focus on the economic dimension without bearing in mind that it's actually powers around social policy that are the longer term kind of foundation to economic prosperity. So we're thinking education. I know there's been a lot of skills, but more broadly around education, social security and labour market activation, especially particularly, and health. And I think health is the big one where there is a need for more localised power and control, so that the government's ambitions on prevention, ambitions on moving from treatment to prevention, moving from hospital to neighbourhood are actually realised. So sometimes these areas are actually areas that mayors don't necessarily want to take up, because if they come with services that that are very difficult to deliver or have a potential for crisis, then there are concerns. I don't know in the case of London, but in other parts of the country, certainly concerns about picking up some of these services. But that's, I think, the broad area of policy. And I think you can look to an obvious international comparator being Paris, which has more control over some of those areas and certainly over service delivery. I think that area is crucial, and I think health is a huge opportunity for future devolution, because it draws together all different aspects of the powers that mayors currently have, with the potential of delivering change that, you know, could be quite significant for the local population.
Thank you. I don't know who else. Yep.
I think actually I'm going to go sort of a slightly more general level on a principle. So in the English devolution white paper, there's a devolution framework. But if you look at it, it's said to be the kind of way in which decisions are made. But if you look at it, it's the kind of the product of what we know as a ministerial right round. It's a kind of collection of things. And actually, I think to have a proper framework to determine for each piece of legislation, each new policy, both existing and new, an assessment at which level in government that would best sit, and the funding to follow it would be something that would then future-proof the powers of the Mayor and for you, the Assembly, as policies evolve in future. So I think, you know, you could always look at specific policy areas, but I think having a principle where these things get debated, and where you could retrospectively go back to some powers and think, right, no, we should have that in London, and include that in the devolution bill, would be a great benefit to you particularly in the future, as things change, and you know, and you want to revisit some of those past decisions.
And I'm going to come to Patrick in a moment, but if I can just stay with you about fiscal devolution as well. The Mayor has, and the Assembly has, previously made a case for the right to have our own tax-raising powers and other.
Yes.
Is that something you'd be in favour of and we should be asking for?
Yes, because I think this is all part of the picture, isn't it? If you want a decentralised state, then you have a decentralised taxation model. If we were in Canada or Denmark, it would actually be you collecting national taxation and NI, and then you'd be remitting the remainder to government after you had spent what you needed to do on hospitals, health, transport and everything else. So it would be residual to government, not residual to local government. So there are other models that you could look at.
Yeah.
So just to add quickly that I think there is a case for, framing this discussion more around something we rarely talk about in the English governance debate, which is the principle of subsidiarity, which again is a principle that partly emanates from the European Union, but it is the idea that powers are exercised most effectively both in terms of policy outcomes but also in terms of democratic engagement if they are closest as possible to citizens. And I think that this is the kind of question that the current English devolution debate is kind of refusing to engage with in an odd way, partly because in many ways what we think of as devolution is actually a much more limited form of delegation rather than actual devolution. And I think that that's the kind of debate that we need to start having, including in London. I think to come to your question specifically, rather than thinking about in the abstract what would be good to devolve, I think it's better to think in terms of what are the policy challenges that London faces and how can they be better addressed at the London governance level. And I think the examples that Jack alluded to around labour market participation, the delivery of healthcare, and of course the government has undertaken the somewhat unusual move of abolishing NHS England without deciding what's going to replace it. So what should be the involvement of the London governance structure in the future delivery of healthcare? I think that's an absolutely crucial question. And then I think there are other areas as well, child poverty, for example. How could that be better addressed at the London level? And I think to come to your specific point about fiscal devolution, I mean, it's clear that when you look at cities around the world that are able to exercise powers to a greater degree than London, an essential part of that mix is fiscal devolution. And so for me, there is an unanswerable case for a much greater devolution of fiscal powers to the mayor and the authority in London. What exact form that takes would clearly be up for debate, but I think that has to include a mixture of levying taxes on individual citizens, levying taxes on businesses, but also ensuring that the fruits of growth that come to London can be used more within London rather than simply funneled back and redistributed across an English and UK-wide financial settlement. I think one of the crucial aspects of devolution is that it incentivises places to grow and become more productive. And if you don't have fiscal devolution, you're missing a crucial part of what devolution is supposed to be about in the first place.
Yeah, thanks. Can I just say something on fiscal devolution? Because I think, although I'm broadly in favour, it's a principle, I think people mean very different things by it. I think there's a model where you think about certain levies, things like a tourist tax or something like that. Then there is a model in which you have places basically being able to set varying income taxes or tax on businesses, etc., corporation tax. I have a big concern with that model because I think it ultimately drives spatial inequality. And even with some redistributionary kind of measures, there is the risk that you have far greater spatial inequality, which I know, not preaching to the converted this time, is a problem when people look at the dominance of London within the UK. And if there was fiscal devolution on income or corporation tax, for example, then London would be in a far better position to absorb more of the wealth that is in the country. So I think a model of fiscal devolution that looks to try and address spatial inequality is far more important. Thinking about a tax that is specifically for the strategic tier or local tier of government that might be raised nationally but goes to that level is a far better way of doing it than having a situation where you have areas competing against each other and end up with the kind of spatial inequality that they have in America, where this model is perhaps clearest.
Yeah. Thank you. And then if I can just finish and go back to Dr. Morfett to start, you talked about the OECD's international good practice guidelines for devolution. So my question is, looking to the future, if the Mayor and the Assembly were to get further powers, what would be good practice in how to implement them and what should be avoided?
I think, gosh, that's a big question to end on.
Can we learn from other international cities where they've either done it well or they haven't?
Well, I think what I'm going to say is if you dipped into the devolution handbook, I say there are the 10 guidelines that I've talked about, and each guideline has a whole chapter where they talk about how it's operated in other countries. They've talked about which policies have worked, and they've given sort of practical examples, but not just in a rosy glow. It's all backed with research as well, because there's a 25-year research programme. This is the culmination, or 20 years, this was a culmination of that. So it's not just an international organisation plucking out out of the air, this might be a good thing. It's really based, and a lot of the work's been done by academics at LSE as well as other universities. So I think that would be, I would suggest mining that a bit more for ideas that you think, particularly in those areas where the mayor doesn't have powers at the moment. And I'd perhaps be looking to you as an assembly perhaps commissioning some research or offices to look at that in more detail, to work up how those principles which are missing in the white paper and missing from your current settlement might actually operate in London to London's advantages and to the advantage of the rest of the country as well, as Jack says. So, and I think there are points where you could make a case. So I think I'm going to duck that slightly in detail, but I think that because that research is so much better than I could just give you off the top of my head, I think. So.
Thank you.
Just on the guidance itself from the OECD handbook, I think there's a few points in there that are worth emphasising in terms of good practice around implementation. I mean, one is about building capacity, because I think one of the persistent problems we see in other areas of English devolution is devolving responsibilities without having capacity in place at the sub-regional level. Now, London is in a different position because clearly London has significantly more capacity at the London government level. But if you're going to take on new powers and responsibilities, making sure that the capacity exists to discharge those would obviously be, I think very, very important. I think a clear allocation of responsibilities and an understanding of those. I think to go back to the question that was asked by Assembly Member Giorgio earlier, I think one of the problems in the devolution settlement has been a kind of opaqueness and ambiguity about who is exercising accountability and responsibility where. So I think being clear about that is a specific recommendation in the OECD guidance, and it's something that should be built on. And then finally, just coming back to what Jack was saying, another of those 10 guidance principles is about the importance of equalisation mechanisms. And I obviously totally agree that if you're going to have a fiscal devolution settlement for London, that's also got to be part of a broader UK-wide fiscal settlement that does address the need to ensure that spatial inequalities are properly addressed both through taxation but also through redistribution.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Right, well, thank you so much to our guests. I think one thing we definitely would like to get potentially outside of the meeting, but further follow-up on is certainly in terms of the OECD's city comparators that we could be looking at in terms of obviously driving that growth agenda, but also the social outcomes that Jack and you all have referred to in your answers. But very, very riveting conversation this afternoon. Really appreciate all your contributions, and a huge thank you. We're now going to take a short adjournment for change of the panel, so we'll come back in 5 minutes, so 3:27, and until that point I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you. Welcome back to the GLA Oversight Committee. We now have moved on to the second part of our discussion, and I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests. To my right, got Hamida Ali, who is the Head of Learning and Practice at the Future Governance Forum. Got Rob Anderson, who is the Research Director at Centre for London. Richard Brown, who is author and freelance consultant at Richard Brown Consulting. And David Phillips, who is our Associate Director for the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So welcome all. Look forward to the debate we'll be having. And I'll kick off with the first question and start off with yourself, Hamida. So the first question is, could you give us some examples of how you feel London has benefited from the devolution powers that it's been given over the last 25 years?
Thank you so much, Chair. Really great to be included in your discussion today. First, perhaps just to say a couple of things about the Future Governance Forum. We're a relatively new, progressive but non-partisan think tank, really grounded in collaboration and practice and really focused on the how of practical implementation over the what of policy. And devolution is one of our central priorities, alongside consideration of mission-driven practices. Just a couple of personal declarations and a corporate one. So I was a Labour councillor in Croydon between 2014 and 2022, including as council leader for the last 18 months of that period. I'm also a former GLA member of staff within the HR function between 2017 and 2023. And then just to declare that at the Future Governance Forum, we're working with Metro Dynamics on a piece of work for London councils to look specifically at what a successful, effective strategic authority looks like to inform some of the work that they are doing on governance in London that you've already kind of reflected on yourselves. Just a few points perhaps to begin with on our view as an organisation on devolution. So firstly, we feel really strongly that devolution isn't just a technocratic exercise in itself. It's a means to an end. It should be unlocking greater prosperity and improving the quality of life for everyone in our communities in every part of the country. Secondly, and it's been talked about a little already, there should be much greater connectivity between national, regional and local government. So devolution shouldn't be a case of powers stepping down one layer and stopping there. Local government is an important part of the ecosystem and the right powers should be in the right place of the system. And thirdly, our view is that mission-driven approaches to governance should really underpin devolution. We published a report not long after, the same month that the new government took office, and that was about trying to set out how the government could implement its agenda on devolution. And we argued that government should hit the ground running and should build on what's already in place. And broadly, we think that the proposals in the white paper align with that outlook. So you've talked a lot about greater certainty of funding, multi-year settlements, wider application of the integrated settlements, removing all that heavy prescription potentially and competition around funding. I think where we've seen less movement nationally is what a truly mission-driven approach to devolution could look like, although I don't think that's the case in London. The GLA and London councils are spearheading that quite intentionally. But the most significant shortfall from our point of view is the scale of fiscal freedom to match the scale of policy and powers that mayors are increasingly being empowered with. On London, our recommendations supported the sort of next era of devolution in London. There's no question that as London going first, the GLA and Assembly model has not just changed the governance landscape, but it has changed and transformed and resulted in significant change for Londoners, which is the point, and proving that principle of subsidiarity, which Patrick Diamond was talking about, that the centre is not necessarily best placed to make decisions about places. But at the same time, the model is a reflection of its time, which also feels like a feature of the conversation, particularly when you look at the evolution of governance arrangements elsewhere in the country. In terms of successes, I'll point to a few successes from a London point of view and a few challenges. The first one I'd point to is the policy levers that the Mayor has and able to control directly. The clearest and most obvious one is transport. Having direct control over integrated transport across buses, the underground, and now to some extent some of the overground network has transformed Londoners' experiences of public transport in the last 25 years. And perhaps linked to that, there's a level of clarity, and again, this was a feature or touched on in the previous conversation, conversation, that the GLA Act provides in terms of functions, which is much less codified in the evolution that we've seen in other mayoral combined authorities. And there's a benefit which also has its drawbacks in the sort of concentration of executive power held by the mayor to give real clear political direction on policy. I think more local accountability on public services. It's not the only one, of course, but I'd perhaps illustrate the point with reform to police accountability in London. It's not a perfect system, but the power concentrated in the Commissioner is rightly open to local scrutiny. And financial capability, just the sheer weight of the size of the GLA group budget gives the mayor a flexibility in which you wouldn't have, and just by dint of its size. Is not open to other mayors in other regions. And then finally, on successes around convening power, it's also been touched on and it's less codified, it's less tangible, but there is significant power in the simplicity of a mayoral figure in bringing one of the most diverse global cities on the planet together, whether that's in terms of coordination of partners across a system, trying to deliver important vital services, whether that's tackling vested interests or in the interests of community cohesion, celebrating or marking moments of either great joy or sadness, perhaps most starkly illustrated on both the 6th and the 7th of July 2005. In terms of challenges, the most significant one, and it's been quite a feature of your conversation already, is around financial freedom. The fiscal levers available to mayors should match the scale of the policy responsibilities that they have, and that's no different in London. And Patrick touched on this. Financial freedom, even when budgets have been released downwards, it's often just changed the buyer, as it were. It feels much more like delegation rather than devolution. And there are some obvious examples around employment support and others. We think that government's position is the right one: greater certainty, multi-year settlements, widening the application of those integrated settlements, although I think the conversation you had just now with the first panel on integrated settlements was really interesting. But we would support the case for much more reform on fiscal freedoms, not just on raising additional monies, as Jack was touching on earlier, but how you use existing public spending across the system. So in particular, we think about some of the pilots in 2009 of total place, so the idea that a single place-based financial envelope is organised and decided on across institutional boundaries, across a place, is important. And connected to that, and the earlier panel touched on this as well, is the role for public service reform within the system, within the London system, which feels much less clear. And there's real significant opportunity to use the mayor's ability to coordinate again across the system in terms of social policy outcomes that should really, as Jack was saying earlier, be driving economic prosperity. Last point is around the asymmetry of governance, and you've reflected on this already. Notwithstanding London's size, the complexity of governance, 33 councils, the size of the population, I think from our point of view it is just a relatively natural question, given the evolution of governance arrangements elsewhere in the country, as we come to the next piece of legislation on English devolution, to sort of question what should that look like in the context of that journey.
Thank you very much, Hamida. And remember, we will be asking other questions as well. So if we can focus on the positives, successes so far of these 25 years, we will come to challenges thereafter, and certainly plenty of other questions to cover off other ground. So, Rob, I'll pass on to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you, committee, to represent the Centre for London, London's independent think tank. So the first thing to say is to echo remarks earlier that London's devolution story is and should be acknowledged as a success. In a way, the government's current programme can be read in part as a testament to this. Some of the biggest commitments we've seen involve just extending powers already available and impactfully implemented in London to other parts of the country. So London acting as a kind of de facto benchmark for devolution should be a testament to that success. A couple of examples. We've already heard about transport. Just that Transport for London has been instrumental in delivering, first of all, innovation, such as the Oyster card, replicated globally, service improvement, the metroisation programme in the North East London increased ridership by 80% in just 4 years, and also major infrastructure projects like the Elizabeth line, where devolved financing was a critical part of success. I'm going to give one other example here where devolution has played a decisive role and where we're a global leader as a result, and that is in improvements in air quality. So ULEZ is the largest zone of its kind in the world, covers 1,500 kilometres, and as a result, we now have much lower rates of toxic air. NO2 concentrations are 27% lower as a result of ULEZ. But what sits behind these successes is a unique strength to London. It's the relative maturity, stability and competence of our devolved institutions. The GLA has developed institutional memory and expertise, and in some areas, as I was saying, become a global leader in public service delivery. It is not insignificant that the GLA has outlasted some government departments over the last 20 to 25 years with comparative stability and political continuity. A further key success is the Mayoralty's role as a voice for the capital, a champion for London, nationally and internationally, helping secure investment for our economy and infrastructure. This is particularly vital for a global city like ours, unlike some of the other cities that have been under discussion today. Our recent report, Arts for All, about arts and cultural participation, also highlights the role of that championing function, that role of the Mayor, for example, centring our educational and cultural institutions in moments like the 2012 Olympics and interventions like the Borough of Culture, sort of expanding the kind of, sort of cultural offer, not just in the centre, but across the city, really, really clear in our evidence about the role of the Mayoralty and the GLA there. I'm going to pause there because that's where I segue to start talking about the challenges, and I feel like we're going to get to those.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that, Rob. Thank you. Richard.
Thank you, Chair. Just to give some sort of credentials, because I don't really represent anyone, they may have got the wrong Richard Brown, or alternatively I'm here because I was involved in this... It's very nice to be here. I was involved in the set-up team 25 years ago and worked in the early years of the GLA in the Mayor's office. I've also co-edited and written a book called London's Mayor at 20, which came out 5 years ago, and have been involved in other elements such as the Olympic Games and Centre for London. So, yeah, thank you for inviting me. I think just in terms of observing, I'll just make one preliminary remark in terms of observing successes, and it came up a little bit the last time round. I think when we talk about devolution can do all sorts of different things, and I think the white paper actually quite helpfully sets out some of those. And it can be about tailoring services locally, it can be about more efficient delivery of services, it's about subsidiarity, it can be about joining up, it can be about innovation. I think you can probably see successes under all those headings in London. I think when we're asking for more powers, if we are asking for more powers, being clear which of those boxes, possibly several of them, they tick is very helpful. I think one of the biggest successes is you're all still here. The GLA has outlived the GLC. It's now quite an august, well-established, despite changes in government, despite controversies at some stages about various different mayors. The GLA is still here. I think it's also had its powers extended, which is a tribute to things working well. I think one of the earliest and most important successes, I think, was congestion charging. It was a commitment by the first mayor. It was a highly complex scheme. I think it was a scheme that central government would have never implemented, because I think there were far too many people who stood to lose. And it's now formed the basis, obviously, of a succession of further similarly implemented innovations, and that it's still relatively world leading. I could say how disappointed I am that road user charging hasn't been applied more broadly, but it was an important proof of concept, if you like. This was an organisation that could deliver something on time, efficiently, that would work on the first day. And I think that was really important for the confidence of the organisation. It was also important for the extension of powers, I guess, in 2007. I think another area of success has been planning. I think the original GLA Act was full of anti-Livingston clauses. There were quite a lot of anti-Livingston clauses at the time, one of which was the relative restriction of the mayor's planning powers, particularly in central London, where it was worried that Livingston might sort of impede the march of global capital. Whereas actually Livingston welcomed the march of global capital, some would say perhaps too much, and therefore more powers were awarded, and the positive planning power was obviously awarded in 2007. So I think planning has been a success. I think we can quite often find ourselves looking jealously at other cities and what they have, but every time I talk to people, certainly in New York, they're really jealous of the way that we've managed to integrate planning and transportation in this city. Other cities don't have that. They have some tools that we'd like to have, such as tax increment financing, but the ability to plan through the London Plan, through individual planning decisions, through transport planning, the infrastructure of the city and its development in the same way has been important. And it's been an area of continuity between the mayors, so how you can actually see a progression of big infrastructure projects going through all three mayors, and I think that's a tribute to the success of that part of the system. I think, I mentioned the London Plan there, I think London 2012, I'm not sure it's actually a success of devolution. It's a success in many ways, however. But I think mayoral development corporations, again, are an interesting model, which is perhaps the new mayor is planning to push further. I think he is. I'll come back to challenges. I think they tend to be where there's ambiguity on accountability in particular and double handling of problems, but let's pick up those later.
Thank you so much, Richard. David?
Hi, yes. So a bit of background first. So my expertise really is on finance and funding of local government and devolved government. So I'll have a bit more to say about that than perhaps some of the kind of policy areas. So bearing that in mind, I think kind of one area where there has been, I guess, some success has been on the kind of fiscal side of things. So there has been this use of the business rate supplements to help fund investment in transport. Also, perhaps a bit less commented upon is how well London has done rates for retention. So when they had the increased retention rate in London, replacing the grant funding from central government, London actually got quite a bit of sort of above baseline funding growth from that. That might change going forward. There's going to be a reset to the business rates system in 2026. So I think there'll need to be a look at kind of what that might mean. Councils are very concerned about that. It's a big part of the budgets. I think Greater London Authority, we need to look at that as well. I wanted to sort of echo something that was said here about, I guess, citywide decision-making. One thing that the UK has traditionally lacked, if you like, is a middle tier of government, especially for England. And there are some things that are not best done at the local authority level or at a central government level, but at a sort of middle tier, sort of like city regions or sort of like groups of counties and so on. And I think you can do that, from other types of arrangements. But I think having the kind of like the mayoral system, the kind of Greater London Assembly, it gives that sort of direct democratic mandate for that middle tier of government. And I think kind of some of the areas where it's been kind of applied in London around housing, planning, transport, those are areas where that kind of that middle tier, I think, makes a lot of sense. On transport, I agree the system kind of works well. I would put some kind of caution in that. I think one of the factors that is sometimes kind of forgotten about when thinking about London's successful transport system is that compared to other places in the UK, at least, with similar ridership, similar levels of... It's basically quite well funded. So if you'd compare sort of, the sort of subsidy per journey for other areas that have lots and lots of journeys, traditionally London has had higher subsidy per journey not compared to the country as a whole, because subsidy is high in areas where, rural areas where you don't get many journeys and you still need services, but compared to other areas with similar population densities, similar riderships, so on. So part of the success comes from funding as well as the sort of operation model there. And I think, that's what I'd say. So I think kind of, there have been some fiscal successes. I think there is this kind of success of a middle-tier government which is being replicated across England. Transport, I think, is a success, but it's partly based on funding. And the last thing I'd say, and again, echo some of the kind of points, if you look at the white paper on devolution, it basically uses London as an example. In many places, it's like, we're bringing other areas up to London. So clearly the government considers it a sort of success.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Would you like to... I always like to celebrate successes, but we haven't got time to pause too long, so I'm going to move back to you, David, to let us know what you feel are the challenges that need to be addressed as we look forward.
So again, I'll sort of, rather than sort of put individual sort of policy areas, I'll probably focus a little bit more on the kind of fiscal side of things. So one of the things with the white paper, not just in terms of London, but more generally, is it says very little about fiscal powers. On the London side, there's not even a sort of firm commitment for pooled sort of single budget. It's a sort of idea to look at it. So kind of London's a bit behind the curve on that, even compared to the other sort of established mayoral combined authorities. In terms of fiscal devolution, London's had various finance commissions to look at this over time. I'm not sure they've always got the right answers coming out of those commissions. I'm not a fan of devolving stamp duty land tax to local areas. I think stamp duty tax is a tax we should be reducing, potentially abolishing. Entrenching it by making an important tier of government very dependent on it, I think, gets in the way of that. It's also very volatile. It goes up and down massively during the cycle. And again, it would put a lot of volatility into London's budget. You need much greater borrowing powers if you were to have a tax like that. I think we should be looking at, there are some of these smaller taxes like tourism taxes and probably less so in London, workplace parking levies and so on. But the big one, I think, is local income tax. A local share of income tax. It is done in many other countries. It can be done relatively simply. There would need to be some equalisation. London, a lot of the tax base is in London compared to, say, the northeast and northwest of England. So London wouldn't get to keep all of the revenues raised in London, how much I would like to do so. But and we've written about this, if you're looking for kind of a major revenue-raising lever, a sort of a tax which links to kind of many of the incentives you might want local authorities and middle tiers of government to have, I think local income tax is a good one to do that. So, for example, with business rates, that's about having business premises in your area. With a local income tax, it doesn't actually need to be a business premises. People can be working from home. People actually can be working in neighbouring areas, going to commute into, say, Slough or into kind of areas around London in high-tech industries because it's based on where people live, not where people are working. That also addresses some of the concerns elsewhere in the country that all the tax base in the southeast would be in London because, no, a lot of the people live around London, so their areas would also get some of the tax base. So I think the white paper has missed a trick thinking about how fiscal devolution, the role it can play alongside, devolution of spending responsibilities and simplifying the grant funding that local authorities and mayors and so on get. And I think a case can be made to central government for this. Local and middle tiers of government have long been pushing for fiscal devolution. Traditionally, central government is seen as the blockage on that. Well, over the next 20 years, unfortunately, unless we have significant changes in what the state does, the only way for taxation is up further again. The political costs of that, having that all done at central government, means all the pressures on central government, and it creates a supplicant sort of relationship between subnational government and central government. I think that local government and middle tiers of government like the GLA can go and say, look, empower us, and we'll also kind of help share the kind of, the actual difficult choices we're having to make as a country about how we square off, an ageing population, climate change and so on with the taxes that people are currently paying and are willing to pay.
Thank you, David, and we'll definitely be coming back to that topic. So, Richard, you were there at the beginning. What challenge do you feel that we could better address going forward?
I think I'm reluctant to follow up someone from the IFS on fiscal issues, but I think that's clearly been a gap. I was partly involved in the second of the fiscal devolution commissions. I'm worried that we came up with the wrong answer. We came up with such an ambitious wish list that I don't think it was ever going to get past Treasury, I'm afraid. I do think maybe some more modest ambitions would work, and I think the Welsh example of more bans on council tax is an interesting one, and there's a precedent. It's great when there's a precedent to show people. I think tourist taxes. Intellectually, I love the idea of replacing all these mad property taxes with a single property levy or something like that, but I worry about that from 2 points of view. One, there are so many losers created, so it's unpopular. It would be very hard, even for a very strong mayor of London to do. Two, I'm worried that the way that's discussed in policy discourse at the moment is mainly as a way of getting lots of money out of London to other regions of the country, and the risk is, though I think it's unreasonable. I think it's a surprise how low some council taxes in London are. I think simply plucking the golden goose of London to distribute across the country will be a risk with an integrated property tax. We'll come back to those things. I think it's been where there's been ambiguity, and this came up last time, there's been the biggest challenges. I think the accountability of the Met Police is a good one. 2 Met Police commissioners have been sort of sacked, sort of not quite sacked by the mayor. I think looking again at the accountability of the Met, of what is the Met's London roles are and what its national roles are, and thinking again about those is important. Again, we have the example now of other police and crime commissioners who can sack their chief constable, but the police and crime commissioner for London cannot do so, though, as I've said, 2 of them have managed to sort of do it. I think that's a challenge. I said planning was a success. I think the endless second-guessing from central government can be a problem. Without giving any view on the merits or demerits of it, the situation of Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street last year was ridiculous that you had the local authority and the mayor giving it approval, one Secretary of State calling it in and refusing it, a court case, another Secretary of State calling it in and permitting it. Why anyone would invest in new developments in London, and I appreciate the controversies around that particular development, I don't know with that sort of system. I think it is quite negative for developers. Personally, I think the government should be intervening only in absolutely exceptional circumstances. You set up a Mayor of London. The Mayor of London sets planning policy. There should be a very limited role on matters of general national importance. I suppose, trying to take down Buckingham Palace. I don't know what it would be, but you have to be at a very. I think it should be a very high level for national intervention. It's very hard in this constitution to take away all reserve powers, but they should be much more widely used. I think there have been challenges with things like suburban rail, again, where there's boundaries, where there's confused accountability. Again, it's been, many would say, a no-brainer that the Mayor should take over more of a role in suburban rail, but it's been difficult because of politics, because of the politics of the South East. I think the other areas where there's perhaps more to be done is where the Mayor has assumed a role, but has fewer levers. I think public health is one. I think the current Mayor has focused on it more. But I think, is the Mayor really going to take a lead for London in public health? I think there could be a strong argument for that. Obviously, trespasses on borough responsibilities as well. But at the moment, the levers are relatively limited. It's about setting up initiatives rather than having much control of the budgets going into that area. I think education is another interesting one. I've been doing work for University of London recently, and it's, if you look back to the situation in the mid-20th century when the polytechnics as they were, the colleges as they were, and schools were all under control of the Inner London Education Authority. And you also had ILIA sitting, or the London County Council sitting on the Senate of the University of London. There was something that looked much more like an integrated education system in London. I don't think it's... I'm not suggesting we go back to 1964 or whenever ILIA went, but I think just thinking how the Mayor can have more of a systematic engagement in education and skills. At the moment it feels very fragmentary, and while the adult education budget devolution has been welcomed, it just makes the system slightly more confusing. So I think there's more to be done there. I think that's probably enough for the moment. But I think, that's enough for the moment.
Thank you. Rob?
Thanks very much for that. Just to quickly run over challenges. The governance model is complex. Some might say opaque. I tried to explain it to someone in the pub recently. It didn't go very well. Fragmented, and also in many areas, as we've heard, outpaced by peer cities internationally, and more recently in some areas by the combined authority. Heard in great detail about how we are an outlier in terms of tax and spend powers, retaining that tiny proportion of taxes generated here, 7% here versus more than 50% in New York. We've all heard it. Which means we rely on central government grants, and that leaves us subject to the kind of national political weather. You sit behind a Treasury desk and argue with CLG about grants that were coming to London, and that wasn't very good for London, I would say, despite how good I tried to do my job. And despite that robust case for fiscal devolution presented by the London Finance Commission, that conversation hasn't moved on in a decade, and the current settlement remains arguably inconsistent with the concept of a mature regional authority capable of long-term financial planning. And there's that question of, on one side, of revenue-raising powers versus responsibility, so the money following the power, but there's also a question here about levers and what you use fiscal policy to do. The unique challenges London faces, as distinct from the rest of the country, I think our housing market is one of the most obvious examples, requires a fiscal response. A housing market where demand is effectively unlimited, there is very little to no disincentive to not invest speculatively in the London property market, and tax levers is one of the few meaningful interventions that could be made, whether that's through annual property taxes, disincentivizing under-occupancy, second homes. I, for what it's worth, agree on getting rid of stamp duty, but I think that's the first thing that, say, the GLA could do if it were devolved, is to reduce it in order to incentivize movement from parts of the housing market where properties are not being used effectively to where they are needed. I disagree with the concern about London becoming richer if it is able to take more of the proceeds of growth. We are rich but unequal, and how London's economy currently works involves a lot of those proceeds being retained to perpetuate these inequalities rather than being reinvested into public goods. And it is only fiscal powers that will enable us to reset that. Secondly, our governance and accountability structure is fragmented, and I'm using that word slightly differently to how it was used earlier, and this is not without consequence, most apparent in the relationship between the boroughs and GLA. I won't talk too much about what London councils have said, we're all familiar, but this fragmentation is leading to some perverse effects, and it can be observed, for example, in the response to homelessness and rough sleeping in London today. On the one hand, you've got the borough holding the statutory responsibilities for homelessness, a crisis that is spiralling out of control. On the other, with no statutory responsibility, but perhaps a political imperative due to the relative visibility of rough sleeping, the mayor has made a manifesto commitment to exclusively tackle rough sleeping. And what we have is the separate statutory, financial and political structures of the boroughs versus the GLA incentivise the disparate parts of our government to focus on specific aspects of the crisis rather than take a coordinated approach to what is fundamentally a systemic problem. And this is to the detriment of some of London's most vulnerable residents. Further, there are a number of areas where sort of this patchwork nature of devolved versus non-devolved powers means London lacks integrated levers to tackle cross-cutting issues, so health has come up. It's currently largely outside the GLA's direct control, but there are obviously clear links between health and housing and transport and air quality which are devolved. So there is a logic here to be sort of thought through. This links to the fact, referring to the discussion earlier about multi-level governance, the current setup arguably struggles to account fully for London's scale and diversity. Treating London as a single entity overlooks the distinct needs and identities of its sub-regions. So we recently did some work on West London, highlighting, for example, that West London's economy is larger than that of our next largest cities, Manchester and Birmingham combined. But the sub-regional structure and also the GLA arguably lacks the structures and powers that could deliver the kind of sub-regional industrial strategy that could really kind of unlock that economic potential. So I'll just end quickly to note on a reflection on the wider political context. I think that we've not seen very much chat about London from the government over the last sort of whatever it is, 10 months. And that may be, given our size, complexity and outsized role in the economy, the question of what next is tempting to go on the too difficult pile. And that's why I'm really, really pleased the committee is exploring these questions today, because there's also that temptation to think that London will look after itself. We've talked a lot about successes and we should be proud of those, but the expectation will continue to do well without re-looking at things isn't one we should take lightly. We face big challenges, and I think devolution is not the answer to those challenges in of themselves, but we need to be able to present a compelling vision for how we would use those devolved powers, and I think that's one of the things that was done most successfully in the 1990s. Here is a problem, a transport system that isn't working very well, and colleagues like Richard coming in and doing something about it. And that's the case we need to build today. And in this moment, with government actively exploring what powers could enable the UK's regions more broadly to thrive, it's pretty important that we pose those same questions for the capital.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm going to move over to Assembly Member Russell.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just interested in the our current powers, over policing, fire, skills, culture, planning, health, and housing, environment, economic development, and transport. And these powers are granted to the GLA to do anything that furthers our core purposes, which are promoting economic development and wealth creation, promoting social development, and promoting the improvement of the environment. And there's obviously a whole raft of statutory strategies that kind of flow out from that. Now, I'm just wondering, you've covered quite a lot already, but is there anything extra that you want to say about the way that government's proposed devolution reforms align with the kind of powers that the GLA already has? I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that. Oh, no one.
If I might briefly, I think looking at the white paper, in many instances, it's sort of like bringing other parts of England up to the sort of like level of the GLA. There are a couple of areas where the GLA would sort of potentially lag compared to at least some of the other areas. So one is on this integrated budget. There's not a commitment there. They'll look at it. It's not clear to me why they don't think London is ready for it yet. What is the sort of like concern they've got about the sort of institutional, robustness of London compared to, say, Manchester? Is it just a kind of like a workflow issue at MHCLG? Is they trying to work through things and London's been deprioritised, partly because of what was just kind of mentioned there by Rob? Another area, I think, is around this health. So sort of public health was mentioned. And, obviously that's gone further in Manchester than elsewhere. Although even in Manchester, I think, I've always found it very difficult to understand exactly what is devolved. You read different documents and it explains it in different ways. And as far as I can tell, effectively, it's just sort of a convening role with some sort of extra sort of joint decision-making at or discussion of decision-making at sort of joint boards, but power over NHS budgets still belongs to the NHS, and power over social care still belongs to the councils. So I think if we were going to go down the route of sort of further health devolution in London, I think kind of clarifying, making sure it's much clearer about what the devolution is, because I think quite often it's just kind of, it's missold how much it is devolved in Manchester. For example.
That's interesting because, TfL has done a huge amount of work on integrating public health into walking and cycling policies, and in terms of reducing physical inactivity as a widespread public health measure. But actually, potentially the full potential of that has absolutely not been worked out because of the lack of connection back into NHS and social prescribing and all of that kind of thing, which is going on at borough level. So, yeah, interesting point. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. And was there anything else I wanted to kind of say there?
Don't worry if there isn't. Cause
no, I think we've already touched upon that there's basically nothing on fiscal devolution in the new settlement. I guess the other thing I kind of think about this is that what we've seen in the UK is a sort of a focus of devolution on the economy. So it's all about kind of like, boosting. The aim is to boost growth, and the set of levers are very much linked, quite directly to growth in many cases. You've got housing, you've got transport, you've got adult skills, you've got economic development. We've actually seen a bit more of a centralisation of core public services. So, go out to education, that was taken off councils in the mid-2000s with the dedicated schools grant to a large extent. Social care, they talk of a national care service and more sort of, ring-fence funding and national standards in social care. Now, maybe this is the right approach, but it's basically saying that our local government, but certainly our middle tier of government, that's not about really public services. Its main thing is about economic development and placemaking. I think there is a bit of a debate to be had. Do we think that there's more of a role, whether for local or the middle tier of government, for kind of coordinating and deciding what public services should be done, how should they be delivered, and so on at that level? Because whilst there's a lot of noise about devolution, actually there's a lot of centralisation going on certain things. The devolution is mostly around economic development.
Thank you. Hamida.
Really just to add perhaps to that point, because I think it goes to the view that we have increasingly about what public service reform could offer, and that is a much less clear responsibility within the London system. And it does feel that, and this goes to a point that I think Patrick was making in the earlier panel discussion about how different tiers of government are almost in opposition to one another rather than working together collaboratively in the system. From a resident's point of view who is dependent on some of those vital services that local government is providing, doesn't really concern themselves quite rightly with where that service is coming from. But it does feel like too much of our public spending across local government in particular is chasing very bad outcomes. And there is an opportunity, quite apart from where's their additional money coming from, to look at how we're using the existing envelope more effectively. And is there an opportunity for the regional system to play a role more collaboratively, looking kind of across different elements of the system, whether that's in terms of children's social care or adult social care or elements of health or employment and skills, to be able to change the outcomes and make billions of pounds that's spent up and down the country, admittedly, used more effectively. I think just added to that, there's also something about, which is less of a conversation at the moment in London, but the extent to which the conversation around local government reorganisation, it feels that the white paper isn't really solving or addressing the key problem of how we finance local services. So it feels, including in London, that you have the GLA is a strategic policy organisation that is not demand orientated, whereas local authorities have no control over the demand that kind of comes to them. And none of the proposals, it seems to me, even if you take into account what might happen with local government reorganisation and a sort of ordering and greater consistency across the country, it doesn't feel instinctively is going to solve the problem of the billions of pounds that is missing from our local provision. But how we are spending some of that money at the moment, it feels that the risk of doing something differently is evaluated differently to the risk of poor spending arguments at the moment.
Thank you. Rob, just going back to the devolution reforms aligning with the GLA's current powers.
Sure.
To add.
I think a bit to add here in terms of, I think, the opportunity and kind of the way the government has carved out space for we'll have a chat about London later when we've got a bit more headspace, is that with this kind of maybe the application of their new definition of a strategic authority to London and the competencies that could involve, so particularly like new powers around skills and health. And then you've also got the reorganisation of the health system going on at the same time, which could potentially be a move to greater centralisation. There is that opportunity for evolving how the GLA's kind of strategic powers and sort of what its ultimate objectives are for the city in terms of those kind of issues will currently silo into either individual boroughs or individual competencies flowing down from central government, and where things need service delivery that cuts across boundaries, that cuts across different service areas. So I talked about homelessness earlier, its relationships with public health, its relationship with our skills and employment market, and then also, you know, the big picture of the NHS. So I think, and this is not, I think this is why we're still really early days, and I think there is an onus upon the city to be able to start thinking about what does that bespoke definition of new competencies, new powers and new definitions of what a strategic authority is, how does that work to further the objectives that we have in legislation? Because it seems like, broadly speaking, our trajectory of the last 25 years suggests they are the right ones, and then it's about what new tool, what new sort of arrows to the bow could we bring to these questions with the questions that are at hand, such as, you know, reorganisation of different public services.
Thank you. I'm just going to come to Richard.
I don't have a huge amount to add, so I'll try and do it briefly. I endorse views on public health. I do think there's a challenge with devolving health services per se. I think actually what the role Assembly members or mayoral appointees play in integrated care boards, assuming they are not abolished the day after tomorrow, is an interesting one. I think there's a role for more integration without trying to. I think the challenge of removing a London health service entirely is substantial, but I think there's a lot to be done on public health. I think the skills area is one where I suppose all of these, there's a bit of a question of what's the regional case, and I think skills where you're responding to a local labour market is an important one. I'm a bit more sceptical about some of the social areas, because I think at times a national entitlement can conflict with local tailoring there. We are still a nation that has national entitlements for welfare services, for example. From that point of view, and slightly controversially perhaps, I'm not entirely sure that the funding of social care should be devolved to local government. I think there should be a national health care service to avoid cost dumping, though local government would still be involved in assessing and advocating and integrating. But I think at the moment it's a millstone around local government's neck, and not a particularly helpful one, and one which is going to get even more difficult, I suspect, after the announcements of the past few days. I was looking at this, and London is particularly exposed in terms of the pay and conditions and internationalisation of the care workforce, which brings me to one slightly more challenging area where I think London could have more power. We talked about this when I was at Centre for London, is whether there will be a role of regional involvement in work permits, regional involvement in shortage occupation lists. London has different needs. The places that resent immigration most are the places with lowest immigration. The north of England has 80% British care workers. London has 52% British care workers. For them, a loss of international care workers is not a big problem. For us, it is a big problem. So some role for London in, I think this is so unlikely it could be regarded as entirely toxic, but some role for London in immigration policy and work permits and shortage occupation lists, I think is worth looking at.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I know Assemblymember Bukhari just wanted to follow up on that particular point, actually, about education quickly. Yeah.
Really quickly, it was what you said earlier, Richard. I'm a teacher by profession, and I remember the days of ILIA, and I was wondering what your opinion is, whether we should be pushing back into that kind of structure or not, or is that something that we should just not even think about? But I just very quickly just wanted to get your opinion.
I think very quickly, I suspect those days of a big education authority running so many schools directly in the same way are probably gone. I think the diversity of school provision now is such, but I think with the mix of the academies, the maintained schools, I think, however, and local management of schools everywhere, I think, however, whether the role of oversight is better done on a London-wide basis rather than a borough-by-borough basis, and looking at special SENDs and looking at some of those broader services, whether that's better done at a London-wide level, I think is worth looking at. But I don't think going back to an education authority managing that many schools is practical at this stage.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCartney.
Sorry, now it's been raised, though. I know the Mayor and other Metro Mayors, actually, the 16-plus skills budget is something that is like a prize they all want. Is that something you think that we should have oversight of?
Yes, I mean, I can see that argument. Certainly a level of oversight. I think just the provision is, again, complex. But I think it should be possible to actually see what the pathway from 14 onwards is through to... Again, universities are another difficult case because they obviously have national and international catchments. But I think a level of oversight, a level of standard setting and strategy setting, I think would be helpful for the Mayor to have. I think precisely how budgets follow that and budgets are tweaked in response to that is more complex.
Thank you. Go on quickly, Rob.
Just as another area we can point to in terms of success, you know, with the devolution of the adult education budget to London, we did see enrolments rise a lot faster. So we have prior in this space, and there is also then it's about the money following the power as well. So things like the apprenticeship levy comes into this question.
Very quickly, sorry, back to Caroline's question earlier. One thing I was thinking about as we were talking is there are some areas where I think we might see some insourcing by local authorities in the next couple of years to try to reduce costs. So that includes things like specialist children care placements, specialist SEND. Now, I think local authorities are often too small to necessarily do this. Can the Greater London Authority kind of play a role as sort of, you know, a convening body to kind of like say, let's, you know, rather than set up separate structures to have joint procurement and other things, can Greater London Authority kind of play a role, some of that, engaging with local government? I don't know whether that would work in terms of the institutional arrangements, because I think it's quite separate to the local authorities, but it could have that sort of, you know, given its cross-London mandate, it could have some sort of infrastructure in place to help with that.
That's really helpful feedback, and certainly as a chair of governors at a special school, I can completely appreciate actually the huge variances in terms of provision and level of provision across London's boroughs. If boroughs can even keep those, provide that support to those children within the city's boundaries. I'm just going to come back to fiscal devolution. A number of you have already touched on it, and for those of you who have already answered this, please don't feel like you need to repeat yourselves. But if there was one key lever that you felt that we should be asking for from a fiscal devolution point of view, what do you feel that should be? So maybe Rob.
I won't repeat kind of my overview in terms of powers, and I think, you know, kind of usual suite of property taxes which our peer cities hold, which are appropriate to the kinds of powers that local and regional government have. But in terms of like the starting position, you know, that question around business rate retention it still shocks me that we went from 70 to 100% back down to 75%, despite, as you say, the increase in take. And I do think that does come from Treasury nervousness of how they're going to balance the big spreadsheet of doom when it comes to spending review day. And I don't think that's a good rationale for thinking about how to do fiscal policy.
I think it's just maybe to make a point which is not dissimilar from one that Patrick made earlier, which is around the sort of culture around at national level in conversation with regional level about how money is apportioned. So it comes back to this point about pooled budgets, total place, that sort of approach, and how making a change to how money is genuinely devolved and not just delegated seems to require a disproportionate level of making a case that's substantiated with significant evidence. And I understand that points that Janice and others were making earlier about the importance of accounting for public money, but at the same time the sort of general practice of how we're funding so much at the moment, which seems to go to so much waste, lack of coordination, delivering not the best public services that really meet people where they are and where their needs are, that actually if you just took the same existing financial envelope but organised that in a way and genuinely devolved that in a way that perhaps regional and local could collaborate more together around how that was spent, could result in much better outcomes, which could be, from a social policy perspective, which could then be driving that greater prosperity that we desperately need across London, let alone across the rest of the country.
I've certainly seen that trialled in Queen's Park Community Council, which is the only parish council in London, but it'd be really good to get some examples of how you feel it's worked well elsewhere, Hamida, shared as part of the evidence that we look at. Rob, you wanted to come back? Sorry.
I suppose I've already said what I think the priority should be, so I won't repeat that. I just think there's a challenge here, and there's another cultural point, government cultural point, is the balance between continually resetting and rebalancing and allowing cities, including London, to keep the proceeds of growth and efficiency and good performance. And I think if you look at the US, where obviously there is a lot more fiscal devolution, there is a lot more willingness to see cities go bust, to see cities actually stranded. I don't think we have that culture. We have a culture where the state will support cities, will support local government. And so I think it is difficult to go too far down lines of retaining the fruits of growth without government wanting to do a reset, wanting to do a rebalancing. And I think just it's tricky to calibrate those.
Okay, I was going to say, so I actually think it's the time to be bold and ambitious on this. I think kind of my concern with the London Finance Commission in 2013 or 2016 was partly that the timing wasn't quite right, but partly I think it was ambitious, but not ambitious on the right taxes. I think that if you craft a message, and it is heard not just by London, but heard from councils, heard from the north, that this is about empowering us and changing our relationship with you so that we're not always coming to you to ask for money, I think there will be more openness at the Treasury to that kind of message now than there was 10 years ago, because they're staring down the barrel of a fiscal gun. And I think that there will be more openness to that. So I think there's a time to be bold. And I would say if you were going to be bold, it's ask for a local income tax.
Thank you. Rob?
Just to build on, it's all about balancing the kind of revenue-raising powers on the one hand and what you want to do with them in terms of spending, and that's where I think things like the welfare, welfare is a huge area of policy, and I don't think London is going to be advocating to be able to, to have control over pensions policy. However, there are very specific sort of quirks of the welfare benefit system, such as the component of local housing allowance that is the TA subsidy rate, which is currently causing us a lot of problems. And having a revenue-raising capability, or say a hypothecation ability that allowed us to address that while not getting into the space of, well, now we need to do it for the whole country and it won't work very well, something that is breaking our system but is locked up in Fortress DWP, I think that, again, has become part of that kind of coherent, ambitious and compelling case overall for what we want to do to address the city's challenges and having the appropriate levers in order to be able to do so.
So I'm getting from all of you sort of being clear about how that money is going to be spent. You've got local authority level things like the social care precept, which have been introduced, and obviously, at our level, you've got the Met Police specific element of the contribution there. Assembly Member Georgie.
Thank you, Richard. In this wider conversation about fiscal devolution, you made a comment and said that council tax is too low, far too low, I think were your words, which I think you might be one of very few people in London that have that view. But I think there's a context behind what you're saying, which is, so my in-laws live in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, the same size home for what mine is, all right, it's a bit bigger because America, everything's bigger, they pay $14,000 a year in their equivalent of council tax. Now, for that, the local council, and it's a tiny one, only population of 60,000, pays for the police, pays for education, pays for everything barring health. So, having thought about it that way, do you not, it's up to you how you answer, but do you not think there's a context in what you're saying that effectively fiscal devolution should only happen if London essentially gets all powers attached to that level of devolution?
Yes, I think just to contextualise my previous comment, I was meaning that when you compare Band D council tax for Westminster and Band D council tax for Stockton-on-Tees, you see quite a big difference, and it's more expensive to live in Stockton-on-Tees. I'm taking Stockton-on-Tees as an example out of the air, but a lot of places are a lot less prosperous than London, than some London boroughs pay much higher council tax, and I think that just looks weird to people outside the city for all sorts of reasons.
And sorry, just on that point, but I think, would it not also recognise that that's more to do with failures of funding settlements and having uniformity across the country rather than the total amount?
Yes, I would, completely. I think that, I mean, I've had similar experience of looking at houses where I've got relatives living in upstate New York and saying they look really cheap, and then they tell me the property taxes, and I'm horrified. But I think that I think that a more thoroughgoing devolution of property tax, and as I said earlier, intellectually I really like the idea of a flat property, or even, without becoming too Georges, to a land tax levy. It's very attractive to me intellectually, but it would mean, and it could mean, a lot more provision of services locally. But I think we are just not set up at the moment in a federal stroke municipally devolved way that a city administration could go bankrupt in the same way that I think they can in the US, and I think they do in the US. And if New York's situation in the early 80s, and they appealed for federal support and state support, no one was told where to go. And so I think unless we had a big change in national governance culture and a bit more acceptance that actually cities and municipalities sink and swim, it would be hard to have that level of devolution, that level of autonomy, essentially. I think there's always going to be rebalancing in this country.
I think, just as a follow-up, and David, I know you're keen to come in, just very briefly, I think part of my concern around the fiscal devolution thing is exactly what you raised. It's all well and good asking for the money, but because let's be frank, local government is subsidised nationally, right? I don't think anyone has an alternative view to that. That's correct, because local government, as we know, would not survive just on its council tax base alone. But part of the problem with that, as you say, is that local authorities can accrue lots of debt and may very well get that fiscal devolution. But unless national government says, yes, you can have those powers, but if you fall, that's your problem, that perhaps it wouldn't work, which is the gist of what I think that you said. Yeah.
That's probably it. I mean, if you look at, historically, you look at things like Hammersmith and Fulham and their swaps problems, local governments have got very close to the edge in this country at times and have been rescued.
Right, thank you. And then just David, briefly, if you want to come in.
Yeah, so I was going to say two things. I think one needs to kind of think not just about kind of like what is devolved, what's not devolved. There's two sort of elements when it comes to fiscal devolution. There's, if you like, the kind of revenues and the powers that are devolved, and then there's the fiscal equalisation arrangements, the redistributive arrangements that exist between different parts of the country. So if you look at, say, the US, that's got quite a lot of devolution, also not much equalisation, not much redistribution between areas. You've got something like Scandinavia, which has got lots of devolution, but quite a lot of redistribution between areas. Where England has traditionally been is there's a lot of redistribution and not much in the way of kind of fiscal powers. And I think what you can do is you can kind of like you can move on these different fronts in different ways. You can say, let's have more devolution but keep equalisation. Let's not have so much fiscal devolution, but reduce the degree of equalisation. You can do these things separately, and this comes back to kind of some of the kind of points that were being raised earlier about, what is it you think is a national responsibility? Is social care something that should be broadly similar because it's a citizen's right across the country, but what you have in libraries and leisure centres, well, that's okay, that can vary across the country depending on your local preferences and your local tax choices. That might all seem a little bit abstract, but I think the reason I think that's kind of important is that if we are kind of going to, if the Greater London Assembly does want to make a case for more fiscal devolution, I think it needs to think about this equalisation as well, because the central government will be thinking about equalisation. If the Greater London Assembly's, ask is we retain more of the revenue we raise in London to spend in London, the rest of the country needs to do more on the revenue it raises. That's quite a different proposition from give us more powers to raise more revenues at the margin, but keep the redistribution in the background. They're quite different things for central government and the rest of the country to consider. So, without sort of, wanting to kind of create loads of work, I think if you do get on the route of saying, well, look, we think we need to kind of marry this spending side devolution that we want to kind of push a bit further with more fiscal powers, you will need to consider the sort of the complex issue of redistribution and equalisation, which, again, I'm not sure that was considered quite as much in the previous London Finance Commissions. Because I think, again, if you want to get action on this, central government will need to think that this is not going to screw the Hartlepool and Stockton-on-Tees in the world.
Thank you, David. And I think everyone's contribution so far have been about actually the retention is in order to actually encourage growth in that area rather than being the alternative. I'd certainly maybe have a different take to Assemblymember Georgiou in terms of, I think the point was made in the previous one about whether the Danish and Danish model, or was it here? Sorry, where the Danish model, whereas actually it's, and Canada collected locally and then almost just subsidising federal government. So it depends on which way you're looking at, which lens you're looking through. But hand over to Assemblymember Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to ask about another aspect of fiscal devolution, which is proposed integrated settlements. But firstly, I just want to slightly take issue with a comment earlier on that David Phillips, you were talking about. We were talking about the benefits of the successive devolution of transport. You made reference to London having a high level of subsidy for transport. We don't get any subsidy for or grant to operate our transport network. So just wanted to clarify that. Do you want a mic?
You don't get grant, but you get retained business rates, and it was more the case in the early 2010s. Yeah. But at that stage, let's say London Underground, London Overground, the amount of subsidy per mile and per passenger was substantially higher, I think, than other equally used services.
So we're talking about 15.
So we're talking about historically. Now there has been this. It has been kind of coming down over time because there's been the reduction in the revenue support grant, and then
removal of the revenue.
Removal of the capital grant, but some of that's been replaced with business rates. But the reason I mention that is that when it's been discussed elsewhere in the country. About will sort of franchising and integrated transport kind of lead suddenly to the kind of frequencies we get in London, my response has always been no, because in London it's partly that conditional upon just how used it is, at least historically, it was pretty well funded. But
I think it's important to make clear that if you want to improve your transport networks, then absolutely money needs to go into it. However, I just want to absolutely be clear that we're not getting any subsidy for running our just really want to be clear about that, because it's sort of exactly it's stood alone. I think maybe the word subsidy has been bandied around slightly today, slightly inappropriately. But anyway, back to integrated settlements. So it'd be interesting to hear from the panel. Firstly, if you could comment on the benefits of integrated settlements overall, what you think they could bring in terms of devolution. But also, obviously, it's slightly vague at the moment what will actually come. It's exploring, I think, is the phrase that's being used in terms of London. And we had some on the previous panel express some concerns about the level of Treasury control, potentially, that goes along with that might then actually push against devolution. So if you had any comment on that, it would be interesting, because any of you that saw the previous panel did get a little bit lively. So would anyone like to comment?
This is one of the ones I wasn't looking forward to because the previous panel was so comprehensive. But I think the main thing to say is this is early days with regard to the integrated settlement, and there are some principles you want to look for. That long-term certainty around funding, and I was referring to being subject to the political weather earlier, that's a huge opportunity for, regional and local government across the country, in comparison to the environment we've been working in for the last 14 years about how spending envelopes have been set and that kind of thing. So that's going to be a big shift, and we need to be ready for that shift. Meaningful control being vital as well. That decentralisation point, I mean, that thing about Whitehall control over mission boards completely cuts against, like the sort of evidence base behind mission-based government. I'm sure Mariana Mazzucato would have quite a lot to say about that. So I think it's then about paying compelling alternatives. So what would that look like for London? What would the role of the sub-regional partnerships, et cetera, given they will probably be having quite a big role in areas like skills. Silos, I think, I gave just the example within the homelessness space earlier about siloisation and the deleterious effects it has upon the citizen. So I think that's an important thing there. Monitoring and that being proportionate and scrutiny occurring at the appropriate level. I used to do a lot of data stuff, and that question of measuring the thing you want to happen is very, very hard. And I think you'll end up with better quality conversations about performance if that scrutiny is occurring at the level of the action. So, for example, in this room, as opposed to on Marsham Street when it comes to the integrated settlement. And finally, that kind of Uncle Ben quote, greater power, greater accountability. Processes within the Assembly must ensure proportionate scrutiny of any integrated settlement. So, you're talking an awful lot of money. Setting aside transport and policing, for example, you're talking about £1 billion a year. More towards that structure of local accounts committees. We call for that in our most recent report on devolution, and we would very much endorse such an approach. We want whoever the budget holders are to this to be just as scared to be called up in front of a scrutiny committee as a minister is when they're called up in front of the Public Accounts Committee. And they do get very scared, and that's a very good thing. And finally, around borough involvement in design and the management of the integrated settlement, that is really important, even at the basic level as delivery agencies, so setting aside some of the positions raised by the councils in their joint statement, readiness tests around their readiness to implement some of this stuff, and also being able to shape those strategic priorities, particularly in any ways they're going to be measured against it. And I think that's where there's a great role for the GLA in terms of capacity building to ensure that boroughs are set up to be able to service the needs of this new structure of funding delivery. So whether that is data reporting, insight, analysis, all those things that actually make for good public service reform.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Richard.
I just echo. I was horrified, but not entirely surprised when I heard what Janice Morfitt said about the monitoring and performance frameworks. I wasn't aware that that was the type of thing being discussed. As I say, horrified, but not entirely surprised. I think that part of the bid for integrated funding settlements needs to be thinking about, as Rob just said, the accountability arrangements. I think, and that's partly about the Assembly's role, but it's also, I think, about. And this may have changed, but the role of the Mayor's office, that strikes me, is quite underpowered when it comes to holding to account organisations like Transport for London and the Met Police, who have serried ranks of accountants and clever financial people. The staffing here is quite small in terms of the group finance team. I don't know how big it is. And actually overseeing a budget of that size, let alone an integrated funding settlement size, it feels underpowered. It feels like there should almost be something like an office for budget. And I think Tony Travers has talked about that in the past. If we want service providers to be scared like ministers would be going in front of a Public Accounts Committee, then we need something like the National Audit Office operating for London to actually... I'm an ex-Audit Commission employee, so I've obviously got it written into my veins, all this sort of stuff. I'm in favour of the idea, but I think rather than letting central government try and dictate the terms, which isn't even really delegation, it's just sort of acting as a principal-agent relationship, rather than letting central government do that, we need to make sure that they can be assured there is locally accountable, locally tailored arrangements for holding public service providers to account. And that may get complicated because that comes back to one of the other pieces of unresolved business, which is the extent to which central government employees and agents can be held accountable in this chamber.
Thank you. David, Hamida, anything to...
just to perhaps to add and to perhaps revisit this point about the extent to which there really is devolution. So with an integrated settlement, so perhaps taking employment support as an example. So we've done some work looking at what in opposition Labour's policies were and commitment to sort of really devolving to local leaders, because even though we've seen some of that in London and the sub-regional partnerships commissioning some of that employment support, even then it's really only changing the buyer, what that service actually looks like, what does that particular part of London need, how does that align to what the opportunities are from an economic growth perspective, was not really in the control of those, even where we've seen some of that practice in London. So whether if the extent of the controls on the integrated settlement doesn't really allow for that real application of that, again, that subsidiarity principle, I think there's a limit to the extent to which really that prosperity can be unlocked, given that the national mission said London plays a huge role in government's capacity to achieve its missions, and that's true for other regions as well. But I think that ability to be able to have more control over how services are commissioned, designed, in collaboration with the boroughs as well, is really important, or whether it's just an envelope coming down with already preset sort of almost new public management type performance metrics attached.
Thanks. Thank you. David.
And yeah, maybe I was going to say, I was going to discuss this because I think kind of single budgets can give greater flexibility in certain circumstances, but it depends on the sort of arrangements around performance targets. So to give an example, if government wants to achieve certain objectives, say it wants to encourage public health, it can do a ring-fenced grant for public health and then give quite a lot of flexibility to local authorities or prevailing authority about how they deliver on that. And that is effectively how the public health grant kind of works for local government. There's some mandated services, but they can also include some of their spending on, say, libraries and leisure centres and other things that are not traditionally public health services, but have a public health objective, and that satisfies the ring fence on that grant. That gives them some flexibility how they spend it. Alternatively, you can say, we're not going to ring fence the grant, but we're going to mandate you do these things, in which case you replace kind of like ring fencing of grant funding, which constrains your own way, with a prescriptive list of things you have to do, which is a different kind of constraint. So I think the detail of this will matter a lot, and it'll only be a sort of, you know, significant increase in flexibility if the government steps back and says, we're going to prescribe less for what you do, as well as ring-fence the money less. Because otherwise you're just missing one form of sort of, you know, form filling with another sort of form filling.
Yeah, no, that's... Yes, go for
May I just very quickly just add to that point, which I guess comes back to this point about outcomes, and the mission-based approach gives the opportunity to be focused on the outcomes rather than that kind of heavy prescription. And we've heard, be interesting to see what the approach to the comprehensive spending review. We've heard the Chief Secretary to the Treasury talk about looking at sort of prevention and well-being orientated assessments of how they compile that comprehensive spending review, because really the outcome should be the focus from the perspective of that national level, and the sort of local determination, whether that's at regional or borough level, that kind of collective self-determination be able to be applied on the best way to achieve that outcome.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Move over to Assembly Member McCartney. Nothing? OK, thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. Just want to touch on some of the things that David said earlier about being against land tax. I do want to know what your opinion is about the tourist levy and how it's affecting and working in other cities. Do you think that be something that we should be pushing forward, and why has it not started happening already in London?
So I think the economic case for tourist levies is a bit complicated. So what is the sort of, you know, rationale for this tax? Is it to affect the sort of costs that tourists impose on a wider area around, you know, so it's basically a bit like a tax on pollution. You have a tax on tourism, given the cost that imposes, to try to make sure that tourists and the tourist operators account for the fact they're having negative costs on the rest of an area. Is it that standard taxes are not paid for by tourists, and therefore there isn't the sort of democratic or financial sort of incentive to do things to, you know, improve tourism so much through other tax bases, and having a dedicated tourism tax means that you're more financially incentivized to provide the services that tourists would value and tourist providers would value, yeah. So I think kind of when thinking about kind of the rationale for tourism tax, there are kind of two potentially good rationales. That one, they impose costs and they should be a kind of tax to reflect that. 2 is to make sure that we take account of their needs in the way we take account of council taxpayers' needs and business rates taxpayers' needs. I think a less good reason, which I think is often actually driving tourism tax, is the lack of accountability. That, you know, putting up taxes on our residents, where they'll vote against that. Tourism, they can't vote in our area, so we can tax those instead. To me, that's a bad reason, because basically you want there to be a link between tax paid and accountability, you know, no taxation without representation, so to speak. Now, I think in the kind of levels of taxes that are being talked about, you know, I don't think these are major concerns. Now, there's a question, I think, in London about where the tax should lie, and I think it sort of depends on what you're seeing the rationale for the tax as being. If it's like, you know, tourists create some kind of costs, that's probably a fairly local cost, in which case the tourist tax and the tourist revenue should probably kind of go to the boroughs where the tourists are mostly staying at. If it's more that we kind of think, you know, we want to make sure that there's infrastructure for tourism, maybe actually in that case, to kind of make sure there's infrastructure across London, you can have a wider spread of tourism, maybe that makes it more like a London-wide tax. And if you are going down the route, well, it's where we can kind of raise some revenue and these people can't vote, so it's less harmful for us, said, in my view, the less good reason for it. In which case, that probably, again, should be a London-wide tax to make sure that all the revenue is not just being in Westminster and it is helping kind of provide services across London as a whole. Why is it not gone forward? Well, we've seen it kind of go forward in Scotland. We're going ahead with a tourism tax. Wales, it's kind of currently going through. If you follow the debate in Scotland and Wales, it's really quite different. So in Wales, they're up in arms about a £1.25 a head tax that's apparently going to stop anyone from England going to visit Wales ever. In Scotland, Edinburgh's proposing a 5% tax, which is probably more about £10 to £15 a night, given Edinburgh property hotel rates. There seems to be much less noise about that. And I think one of the reasons behind that is that it kind of links to this kind of perception of whether tourism is like over-touristed, if an area is over-touristed, or if an area is really struggling to attract tourists. So in Wales, the concern is that with the rise of, you know, with overseas holidays, it still struggles to attract tourism. Edinburgh, too many tourists, we tax it, it won't really kind of cause much harm, and it'll raise some revenue. So I guess in London, I think they kind of, you know, you need to build a case that kind of reflects how it's seen within London by Londoners, and that central government can sort of buy into. Treasury will be concerned, you know, so again, one of the things that hoteliers and accommodation providers would say here, you know, rightfully, is that in many other countries, whilst there is a tourism tax, there's a reduced rate of VAT on tourist accommodation. That's not true here. We have a full rate of VAT, and if you have a tourism tax on top of that, that leads to higher levels of tax compared to countries like, you know, where they have a tourism tax, but they also have a lower rate of VAT. So it might need to be kind of considered in part of the round with national taxation there as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd asked the Mayor specifically on this one actually before, and I mean, given that London is now the most popular destination, or you know, the best destination to go to around the world, there's an opportunity there. But I think if you look at any of its comparator international city destinations, Paris, Tokyo, New York, Berlin, they all have their own taxes, and I think he was very clear actually in terms of the purpose of it is to support that hospitality industry, and obviously there's an element of tourism work and promotion of the city, which could then be potentially funded through that sort of income stream. So I've got Assembly Member Russell. Oh, sorry, Rob.
Add very briefly on the tourism tax, just two things. So we called for a tourism tax as part of our recent report on arts and culture about reinvesting the kind of work of Londoners to make us a global cultural destination in order to finance the kind of local arts and culture that we're seeing less and less of as a result of reductions in statutory funding. So that is one rationale. The devil is in the detail. I mean, as David just explained really, really well. And, you know, there is a lot of sectoral concerns within London about where, like, on a tax on a levy on hoteliers, you know, and that is a conversation that will have to be had and a debate will have to be made. And that thing about what Londoners Londoners think about this is really, really important. And we actually did some polling on this. We have a representative poll of Londoners we run regularly, and we ask some questions. And basically, one of the reasons why you haven't seen a big press release about it is because they're very split. You aren't seeing kind of unanimous kind of, yes, absolutely, we should tax them, and I want that to pay for better leisure centres, or I want to pay that for more theatres. We can share some analysis of that polling if it would be interesting to the Assembly.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time. Very briefly, are there any pressing gaps or inconsistencies in London's devolution settlement that you think could be addressed through new government policies or legislation? So looking for brief suggestions, and I'll start with Hamida, and don't worry if there isn't anything, because there's so many ideas and thoughts have come through. So.
Yeah, I don't think I'll add anything, but if I change my mind in the course, I'll cool. Indicate. Thank you.
Rob?
Skills, health, reopening the conversation about business rates as a start of 10.
Thanks. Richard?
Nothing more.
And David?
Nothing more, apart from to say that I think if you're serious about fiscal devolution, I think we need to start the conversation on a proper tax, like a local income tax. I think other ones are just sort of tinkering a bit around the edge when it comes to kind of the longer-term fiscal challenges.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Beautifully done, thank you. Assembly Member Beth.
Thank you. I want to come to a specific, perhaps, gap that this Assembly has looked at previously, and whether you had any thoughts on that. And that's around the extension of summoning's powers to extend that beyond GLA bodies, but also to perhaps tighten that up within the GLA as well. Mainly looking at how that would allow us to respond to more pressing emergency issues, to quickly get that information and be more current and be able to scrutinise it in more real time for the public, but also look at those things like Thames Water and other bodies like that as well, to provide a better kind of democratic outlook. I mean, had you looked at those summonsing powers at all, or did you think that's perhaps a gap that devolution could address to improve the powers of the GLA?
I seem to remember, and this may be false memory, that this was discussed during the passage of the original bill, and at one stage, and I think there's an incoherency slightly in how the Assembly's role is described as to being able to look into and scrutinise issues of importance to Londoners. But then, during ministerial right rounds, etc., during the bill preparation, suddenly the idea that permanent secretaries of government departments could be summoned and hands were thrown up in horror. So I think, in a way, for reasons that at one level make sense, accountability needs to be singular. We've talked about where there's confused accountability. It was kiboshed, but I think a duty to cooperate, a duty to be heard, rather than this. I think it might just need to be framed differently to preserve parliamentary accountability for central government civil servants. But I think they should be allowed, encouraged, and actually maybe even required to appear and give evidence. It's not their primary route of accountability. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but it feels there should be a compromise there somewhere.
Thank you. And then moving on to the final question that I had around the balance of further devolution powers. So I suppose ensuring anything devolved to the Mayor allows for proper scrutiny of that. Had you had any thoughts around that?
I would just actually say I was so pleased, Richard, to hear you point about muscling up your own kind of basic bureaucratic capabilities. That ability, just to scrutinise the budget is a very extensive exercise, as you're all familiar, and I know the officers who do that well. They work very, very hard. There's not very, very many of them. That is serious work, and I think that that greater power, greater accountability framing that I raised earlier, I think is salient here. And then in terms of kind of structure, that we do get into the kind of accounting officer style questions that were, I think, thoroughly addressed in the previous panel, so I won't say anything more about that.
Can I add one, just because I know it's been discussed in previous Assembly reports, is the question of confirmatory hearings for mayoral appointees, which I think I think the way things were rebalanced in 2007 makes sense. I think confirmation hearings have been important. I think, again, for accountability reasons, I'd sort of be reluctant to make those, powers of appointment or dismissal. However, I do think the issue of whether the Assembly has powers to impeach the Mayor, which which again were discussed during the 1999, ought to be reconsidered. The Assembly should be able to, if a mayor is causing significant problems with a supermajority, as we know, I think the Assembly should have powers to actually maybe impeach the mayor, maybe trigger a recall petition, because I think the mayor is accountable to the Assembly, the deputy mayors are accountable to the mayor, and I think it's quite important to keep that in reasonably clear.
Thanks. And how about some of the other powers that we see, such as call-ins as well? That's something that's been thrown around in our reports before, and a forward planning document, forward plans for decisions. Are either of those things you would support the Assembly being able to do or receive?
I wonder if there's, actually on that kind of clutch of questions, the ability to call other authorities or other organisations in does seem completely reasonable. And I wonder whether there's, and I don't know really the answer to this, but the extent to which there is a dissonance or an asymmetry between powers for scrutiny at a local level, so at borough level, compared to at regional level. Are they in line with one another? Where are they different? Should there be a kind of consistency across that? My instinct, and kind of drawing on memory, is that in terms of being able to summon summonsing powers is also quite limited within local authorities, and yet actually shouldn't be, given that they're also directly elected at local level. But similarly with the forward plan, at a local authority level, there should be a forward plan that is published, and that's quite a core tool of any, as you all know, as councillors, local authority scrutiny. So I wonder whether there is something about consistency across different tiers of governance and the scrutiny available, and whether there are opportunities to increase that to be more proportionate to the powers that are held at the executive level.
Thank you. And just one final question from me. I'm reluctant to compare the Assembly to other combined mayoral models in the UK. But I mean, if you look perhaps at global cities across the world, where I think Assemblymember McCartney said it earlier, those are our competitors. Is there anything from those models that in terms of scrutiny that we should be looking as good examples of devolved scrutiny and devolution?
I don't know is the answer, but I'm not just to say that. I mean, I think something that was looked at again during the passage of the bill was the New York City Council or City Assembly, which I think was seen, New York to a certain extent is the founding model for the London mayoralty, but the New York was, I think the London Assembly was given significantly more powers and has proven to be a lot more effective than in New York. The City Council is broadly just marginalised by mayors most of the time, as far as I understand it. So that's a negative example.
Thank you. I've got quite a few people who want to come in, so if we can just try to be as quick as possible. So, Assemblymember Bakari, you happy? McCartney, no? Okay. So, Assemblymember Georgie, you're on.
I guess this is going to be a very cheeky question, because today, and I didn't get a chance to ask it of the first panel, many of you have said you're happy with the London Assembly and it's very good we've survived for 25 years. How many of you, just yes or no, would you like to see the London Assembly continue for another 25 years as a scrutiny body? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to go first on that one, Assembly Member, thank you. The answer is yes, but I also want to raise... I used the word opacity earlier with regard to London's governance structures, and that's with regard to engagement with citizens. And we, as I said, do some regular polling of a representative sample of Londoners, and I'm just getting the numbers up now. So 83% of Londoners can name the mayor, 47% can name their MP, 38% can name their councillor, and only 19% can name their assembly member. And all of the powers we've just been talking about, all those scrutiny functions, kind of, the legacy of the good work the last 25 years, that legitimacy does come from London's residents and its voters, and that does mean they have to know who you are and what you do. And I think that is a question for the Assembly going forward.
I think I would say yes, and I'd say I've probably changed my view on that in recent years. And I would say, which maybe underlying that, I was saying, and I think I've gone on record saying, I do not think the London Council's proposal for a committee of London Council leaders is a helpful one. I think it confuses roles. I think it muddies accountability. I think the London Assembly as a not very expensive independent scrutiny body is a much better one than trying to mimic the political context of Greater Manchester Combined Authority, for example, and transfer that to London. It's a very different culture, as was discussed in the last session.
Okay, I'm going to push you both just for yes or no answers on this one, because we do need to conclude. I'm afraid. Sorry. The early bird gets
I'm going to. I hope you don't mind. Apologies. I'm going to blatantly disobey that. Just to make 2 points, I think. Firstly, and particularly with any increase in power, being able to have proper and proportionate checks on that power is vitally important. I would, I suppose, I think maybe just make the point I made earlier that 25 years on, with changes in devolution arrangements that we've seen in other cities, notwithstanding the points about differences in London, but I think there is sometimes a risk of the exceptionalism argument being applied universally, and it is an opportunity, I think, to think about, particularly thinking as perhaps what it felt like to be a former council leader, where there wouldn't be more of an opportunity to be able to inform, to drive and to contribute to some of those decisions. The point I'm only making is not a judgment or an evaluation, but just a moment to be able to look again in the light of what we've seen elsewhere across the country.
I'm going to quite off this one. I don't think it's in my area of expertise as sort of fiscal policy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to all of you for your brilliant contributions, evidence and experiences that we can factor in as part of this investigation. So that concludes the investigation questions, and you're very welcome to stay as we just finish our bits of business. But huge thank you to all of you for attending. Can I ask the committee to note the report as background, to put in questions to the invited guests and note the subsequent discussion? Noted. And delegate authority to the chair, myself, in consultation with the deputy chair and party group leads, to agree any output arising from the discussion. Agreed. Thank you. Move on to the GLA Pay Award 25-26, and our committee members happy to agree to respond? Yep, agree for that. And then move on to the London Assembly Quarterly Budget Report. And again, our committee members happy to note the budget report they have before them. Thank you. We've got the Oversight Committee work plan before us. Again, are we happy to note that? Noted. Thank you. And date of the next meeting will take place on the 12th of June at 10 a.m. in this chamber. And there are no... there is one item of urgent business, which is... to consider to be urgent in accordance with section 100B 4 bracket B of the Local Government Act 1972, namely, of which of course you could all recite off the top of your heads, but namely the creation of a devolution working group. This is on the grounds that the working group should be established at the earliest opportunity so it can commence its work. So we're happy to approve the creation of that devolution working group. With the terms and etc. that are set out in Appendix 1. Thank you very much, and I declare the meeting closed.
Thank you.